I sold my logistics company for $68 million and took my daughter and son-in-law to dinner to celebrate. We went to the fanciest steakhouse in Charlotte. When I stepped out to take a wire transfer call, a young waiter pulled me aside and whispered that my daughter had just emptied a white envelope into my wine glass. So I went back to the table and switched our glasses. 18 minutes later, my daughter collapsed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Dawson. I am 69 years old, and my life was supposed to be settling into a quiet, wealthy retirement. The corridor leading to the restrooms at the steakhouse was dimly lit, lined with heavy mahogany panels and vintage wine racks. I had just finished confirming the final routing details for the company's sale with my bank. I slipped my phone into my tailored suit pocket when a hand lightly touched my elbow. I turned to see a young waiter. His name tag read Leo. He looked terrified. His voice barely registered above the ambient jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. He told me he was clearing the adjacent table when he saw my daughter pull a small white envelope from her clutch. He watched her pour its powdery contents directly into my glass of Cabernet. He said it dissolved instantly. I did not confront him. I did not demand manager intervention or call the police. I handed him a crisp $100 bill, told him to stay completely silent, and walked back into the main dining room. I approached our candlelit booth with measured steps. My son-in-law Gavin was holding court. Gavin is a white man who always believed his corporate business degree made him the smartest person in any room. He was currently waving his hand, trying to catch the sommelier's attention to order a second bottle of our incredibly expensive vintage. My daughter Naomi sat perfectly still. She stared intensely at the bread basket. I slid into the leather booth beside her. I adjusted my posture and glanced down at the polished silver steak knife resting next to my plate. The curvature of the blade provided a perfect, distorted mirror of the table. I used that reflection to time my movement. Gavin finally flagged down the wine steward and turned his entire body away from the table to debate the merits of a French Bordeaux. Naomi looked away, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen doors. In that fleeting fraction of a second, I reached across the white linen. I swapped my tainted glass of Cabernet with her pristine glass. The bases of the crystal goblets made no sound against the tablecloth. I leaned back into the leather upholstery just as Gavin turned around, completely unaware that the executioner's weapon had just been handed to the executioner. The next 18 minutes were an exercise in absolute psychological endurance. I picked up my fork and knife and cut into my medium-rare ribeye. I chewed slowly, tasting absolutely nothing while Gavin dominated the conversation. He bragged loudly about the $68 million corporate buyout as if he had orchestrated the entire deal himself. He spoke about the logistics empire I built as a mere stepping stone for his own future commercial endeavors. I let him talk. I sipped from the safe glass of wine. I watched Naomi out of the corner of my eye. Her breathing was shallow. She repeatedly wiped her perfectly manicured hands on her napkin. She took a long, deep sip from the poisoned glass. I did not stop her. My heart beat with a steady, unyielding rhythm. I remembered the days when my hands were perpetually stained with diesel grease. After my wife Miriam passed away from cancer 30 years ago, I had nothing left but a single rusted delivery truck and a toddler to feed. I drove 18 hours a day. I slept in the cab of my truck on the side of desolate highways. I navigated a freight industry deeply entrenched in systemic racial prejudice, forcing my way into rooms where wealthy men in suits explicitly did not want a black man to succeed. I built an interstate logistics fleet vehicle by vehicle, route by route, fighting for every single inch of ground. I survived ruthless corporate sabotage, predatory lending rates, and grueling nights where exhaustion threatened to break my mind. I survived all of that to ensure Naomi would never know the bitter taste of poverty. I paid for her elite private schools. I paid for her lavish wedding to Gavin. I gave Gavin the chief financial officer position at my company to keep them close. I looked across the table at the two people I had financed for years. I realized they saw me not as a father or a mentor, but as a vault waiting to be cracked open. They believed my age made me an easy target. They were wrong. I survived the brutal reality of the American freightways. I would easily survive this dinner. The steakhouse was filled with the low hum of wealthy patrons and clinking silverware. Naomi raised her fork to take another bite of her salad. Her hand suddenly spasmed. The heavy silver fork slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. She gripped her chest, her knuckles turning white against her dark skin. A harsh, ragged gasp tore from her throat. Her eyes rolled back into her head, showing only the whites. She collapsed forward with terrifying violence. Her face struck the table, shattering the fine crystal wine glasses and sending a pool of dark red Cabernet spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. Gavin leaped out of his seat. His chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. He screamed at the restaurant staff, his face flushed with panic. He aggressively accused the executive chef of serving tainted seafood. He demanded an ambulance. He pointed fingers at everyone in the room. Throughout his entire frantic performance, he completely ignored me. He did not ask if I felt sick. He did not look at my plate. He focused entirely on creating a massive, chaotic scene. The restaurant manager rushed over with a medical kit. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until the red and blue lights flashed through the large front windows. Paramedics stormed into the dining room, loaded Naomi onto a stretcher, and wheeled her rapidly toward the exit. Gavin followed closely behind them, shouting threats of massive lawsuits at the manager. I stood up slowly and watched the ambulance doors close through the glass. I looked across the dining room. Leo, the young waiter, stood near the kitchen doors, our eyes locked. He gave a subtle, terrified nod. The entire sequence clicked into place with chilling clarity. Gavin's loud bragging and aggressive behavior were a calculated distraction. Naomi was the designated executioner. They had conspired to murder me on the exact night I secured a $68 million fortune. I knew if I confronted Gavin now, he would deny everything and destroy the evidence. I had to remain perfectly silent. I had to play the frail, confused old man to uncover the true depth of their betrayal. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room replaced the warm, candlelit ambiance of the steakhouse with a brutal, sterile glare. The scent of roasted meat and aged wine dissolved into the sharp tang of antiseptic and floor cleaner. I sat on a rigid plastic chair in the corner of the chaotic triage center. The adrenaline from the restaurant was still humming through my veins, but I forced my posture into a slight defeated slump. Across the linoleum floor, Gavin cornered the attending physician. His designer suit was wrinkled, and his tie loosened to project the perfect image of a distraught family member. He gestured wildly with his hands, commanding the doctor's complete attention. I focused on the movement of his lips, reading the precise shape of his betrayal. Gavin leaned close to the physician and lowered his voice, though not enough to escape my hearing. He stated with aggressive certainty that I suffered from severe, undiagnosed dementia. He claimed my cognitive decline had become a terrifying burden on the family over the past 6 months. The doctor frowned, scribbling notes on a metal clipboard. Gavin then delivered his masterpiece of a lie. He suggested that in my advanced state of confusion, I must have accidentally crushed my potent heart medication and dropped it into the shared wine bottle, completely forgetting what I was doing. He painted Naomi as the tragic victim of her father's failing mind. I sat in silence and absorbed the sheer audacity of the fabrication. My hands rested gently on my knees. I did not possess a prescription for heart medication. Gavin was building a legal narrative in real time. He was creating a medical record that would paint me as a lethal danger to myself and my family. I remembered sitting in hostile, smoke-filled boardrooms 40 years ago. I remembered white bankers who refused to look me in the eye when I asked for a business loan to expand my logistics fleet. I survived those men by letting them underestimate me and drawing strength from the memory of Miriam's unwavering belief in my vision. I survived by allowing them to talk until they revealed their entire strategy. Gavin believed his corporate degree made him infinitely smarter than the man who built the empire. He was banking on my age, making me a passive target. I kept my breathing shallow and my gaze fixed firmly on the floor tiles. I let him talk. I let him dig the foundation of his own prison. The attending physician finally turned away from Gavin and approached my plastic chair. His expression carried the heavy, practiced sympathy reserved for the hopelessly fragile. He pulled a small pen light from his breast pocket and crouched down to my eye level. He asked me to state my full name, the current year, and the name of the sitting president. This was the critical moment. If I demonstrated the sharp, unyielding intellect that commanded a $68 million logistics firm, I would contradict Gavin's narrative immediately. That would trigger a police investigation right here in the emergency room, forcing Gavin into a defensive panic before I understood the full scope of his financial endgame. I needed him to believe he possessed total control. I consciously slowed my breathing, making each inhalation sound labored and thin. I allowed my shoulders to cave inward, collapsing my chest. I looked at the doctor with wide, vacant eyes. I answered his questions, but I intentionally slurred the year. I hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before recalling the president's name. When he asked me to hold out my hands, I summoned a violent, uncontrollable tremor into my fingers. The doctor's sympathetic frown deepened. He gently lowered my shaking hands and stood up. He turned back to Gavin, speaking in hushed, serious tones. He confirmed that my presentation aligned perfectly with an acute episode of advanced dementia exacerbated by severe stress. He stated that due to the lethal nature of the wine incident, I posed an immediate danger to myself and the public. The physician declared he had no choice but to place me under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold for a comprehensive neurological evaluation. The trap snapped shut exactly as Gavin had designed it. Gavin placed a comforting hand on the doctor's shoulder, playing the role of the burdened but dutiful son-in-law to perfection. He turned his head to look at me. In that brief window shielded from the doctor's line of sight, Gavin's mask slipped. The mask of the terrified husband vanished. He flashed a quick, sharp smirk. It was a momentary, victorious sneer that communicated absolute triumph. He believed he had just successfully neutralized the only obstacle standing between him and a massive fortune. I maintained my vacant stare, locking that smirk into my memory. That single expression sealed his fate entirely. 2 broad-shouldered hospital security guards arrived minutes later. They flanked my chair, their demeanor shifting from medical care to tactical containment. They escorted me away from the chaotic emergency room, guiding me through a labyrinth of sterile white corridors toward the secured psychiatric wing. The ambient noise of the hospital faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. We reached the end of a long hallway lined with reinforced doors. The guards ushered me into an isolated observation room. The space was barren, containing only a metal-framed bed bolted to the floor and a single barred window offering a view of a brick wall. The heavy steel door swung shut. The magnetic lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. The moment that mechanism locked, I dropped the fragile facade entirely. My posture straightened, returning to the rigid, imposing height that had intimidated rival executives for decades. The trembling in my hands vanished, replaced by cold, absolute stillness. I walked to the corner of the room, out of the direct line of sight of the ceiling-mounted surveillance camera. I knelt and reached down to my custom leather boot. Using my thumb, I pressed against a hidden seam near the heel, peeling back a layer of false lining. I retrieved a sleek, unregistered burner phone. This device was purchased exclusively with cash, completely untraceable and entirely disconnected from the logistics company's network. I turned the device on and opened an encrypted messaging application. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. I thought of Jonathan. Jonathan was my corporate attorney, a man whose ruthlessness in the courtroom matched my own brutality in the freight yards. We had destroyed hostile takeover attempts and dismantled corrupt labor leaders together. He was the only man I trusted with the full weight of my empire. I needed him to execute the contingency plan we had designed for a doomsday scenario. I quickly typed out a single uncompromising command. I hit send. The message flew through the encrypted servers, carrying the full force of my retaliation. The text read, "Initiate the ghost protocol. Gavin is making his move." I slipped the phone back into the lining of my boot. I sat on the edge of the metal bed and waited. The trap had been flawlessly set, and the hunt had officially begun now. The heavy steel door of the observation room swung open with a sharp mechanical thud. Jonathan walked in. He did not wear a raincoat yet. His immaculate charcoal suit looked completely untouched by the storm raging outside. Jonathan was a man who moved through the world imposing his own weather. He held a leather folio in his right hand. The attending physician trailed closely behind him, his face flushed with professional outrage and bureaucratic panic. The doctor loudly threatened to call hospital security, insisting that my 72-hour psychiatric hold was a legally binding mandate for my own safety. Jonathan ignored the man entirely. He turned to me and handed me my tailored suit jacket. He then handed the doctor a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the state Supreme Court. 3 years ago, anticipating the vulnerability that comes with aging in a ruthless industry, Jonathan had drafted an ironclad medical power of attorney. It granted him absolute authority over my medical and legal autonomy, superseding any emergency psychiatric directive initiated by a family member. The physician read the primary clause, and his protests died in his throat. He realized he was standing in the path of a corporate legal buzzsaw. Jonathan calmly informed the doctor that any further attempt to detain me would result in a personal malpractice lawsuit that would financially ruin his entire lineage. I buttoned my jacket and walked past the defeated physician without a single glance. Jonathan guided me away from the main emergency room lobby. He knew Gavin would be waiting there playing the role of the devastated son-in-law for the cameras and the nursing staff. We navigated a labyrinth of service corridors and sterile supply hallways. We exited through the rear loading dock, stepping directly into the freezing Carolina rain. Jonathan's armored black sedan sat idling in the shadows, the engine producing a low, powerful rumble. The driver opened the rear door. I slid into the leather seat. Jonathan climbed in beside me and tapped the glass partition. The driver immediately accelerated away from the hospital grounds, leaving Gavin completely unaware that his captive had just broken out of his carefully constructed cage. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt as we merged onto the highway. The first phase of Gavin's trap had failed. I needed to secure my empire before he realized the game had changed. The drive toward the South Park neighborhood passed in absolute calculated silence. The heavy rain lashed against the tinted windows of the sedan, distorting the passing streetlights into bright, chaotic streaks of color. I stared out at the wealthy, manicured subdivisions of Charlotte, calculating the exact timeline of Gavin's movements. He had orchestrated the poisoning at the steakhouse. He had weaponized the emergency room to neutralize me. Now he had a clear runway to execute his primary objective. The driver turned onto my private tree-lined avenue and approached the towering iron gates of my estate. The security parameters recognized the vehicle and the gates swung inward. We sped up the long, winding driveway and stopped directly in front of the massive oak double doors. I stepped out into the storm and unlocked the front entrance, bypassing the primary alarm system with my thumbprint. The house was completely dark and entirely silent. I strode down the grand foyer, walking purposefully past the imported luxury furniture I had purchased for Miriam decades ago. Those velvet chairs and hand-carved mahogany tables were monuments to a love that had driven me to build a logistics empire from nothing. I did not pause to admire them tonight. I headed straight down the eastern corridor to my private home office. The air inside the room felt unnaturally still. I walked directly to the far wall, gripping the heavy gilded frame of a 19th century oil painting. I pulled the artwork aside on its hidden hinges. The movement revealed a flush military-grade biometric wall safe embedded directly into the reinforced steel framework of the house. This vault held the absolute lifeblood of my fortune. It contained the original corporate deeds to my logistics firm, the physical bearer bonds that untethered my wealth from digital banking systems, and the raw legal documents required to finalize the $86 million buyout. Whoever controlled the contents of this safe controlled my entire legacy. I raised my hand to the glowing digital interface, fully expecting the green light of recognition. I pressed my thumb against the glass scanner. I braced myself for the familiar mechanical click of the heavy locking bolts sliding open. My entire counterattack depended on the security of those documents. The glass scanner did not glow green. The digital interface blinked twice before emitting a sharp crimson flash. A critical error message scrolled across the tiny screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, heavy and cold. The biometric lock had not simply malfunctioned. It had been professionally bypassed. The digital security matrix was completely fried, overridden by an external decryption device. I bypassed the scanner, entirely gripping the heavy titanium handle. I pulled, and the thick steel door swung open without a single ounce of resistance. I stared into the dark cavity of the vault. The safe was completely empty. The corporate deeds, the physical bearer bonds, the legal buyout authorizations, everything was gone. The $86 million foundation of my life had been cleanly extracted. I took a step back, my mind racing through the sheer logistics of the theft. I looked down at the pristine hardwood floor beneath the safe. The wood was immaculate, polished to a high sheen by my housekeeping staff just this morning. But right at the edge of the Persian rug, a single fresh scuff mark marred the finish. I crouched down to examine the dark streak. It was a precise, distinct scuff caused by a rigid leather heel. It perfectly matched the bespoke designer Italian loafers Gavin had been wearing at the steakhouse just hours ago. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with devastating clarity. Gavin did not ride in the back of the ambulance with his dying wife. He did not rush to the emergency room to comfort Naomi as she fought for breath. The moment the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher, Gavin abandoned her and drove straight to my estate. He used the chaos he personally orchestrated to buy himself the exact window of time he needed to rob my vault. The poisoned wine was never about murder. It was a calculated, ruthless distraction for a massive financial heist. Gavin had stolen the physical keys to my empire while my daughter fought for her life on a hospital ventilator. I slowly stood up, closing the empty steel door with a hollow thud. I turned and looked directly at Jonathan. Gavin believed he had just stolen my past, but he did not realize I still controlled his future. Jonathan closed the heavy steel door of the empty biometric safe, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silent mahogany-paneled home office. He walked over to his leather briefcase resting on my desk and pulled out a rugged matte black tablet. He unlocked the device with a rapid complex alphanumeric sequence and handed it directly to me. I took the tablet, remembering the chaotic moments just before Naomi collapsed at the steakhouse earlier that evening. She had nervously dabbed her lips with a heavy monogrammed linen napkin. In the ensuing pandemonium, while Gavin screamed frantically at the restaurant manager and the paramedics rushed through the dining room doors, I had quietly palmed that specific napkin and shoved it deep into my suit pocket. Jonathan had taken possession of the fabric during our brief tense car ride from the hospital, immediately handing it off to a private, fiercely discreet toxicologist who owed my attorney his entire career. The screen on the tablet illuminated with an encrypted email sent via a highly secure server. I read the stark clinical breakdown of the chemical residue extracted from the linen fibers. The document listed complex molecular structures and synthetic protein binders that meant absolutely nothing to a logistics man like me, until I read the plain English summary at the very bottom of the page. The toxicologist noted that the substance was incredibly rare, exceptionally expensive, and entirely untraceable through standard hospital toxicology screens. I swiped the screen, reading the detailed breakdown of how the drug interacted with the human nervous system. I felt a cold, heavy weight settle deep in my chest as the true nature of the white powder revealed itself. My mind raced back to the candlelit dinner table, to the precise moment I utilized the reflection in the silver knife to swap our glasses. I had initially assumed my own daughter wanted me dead to inherit the $86 million from the massive company sale. I had braced my mind for the blunt, brutal reality of a straightforward assassination. But as I read the final lines of the medical analysis, I realized the betrayal was vastly more insidious than a simple murder. The powder in the envelope was never meant to stop my heart. The encrypted report stated explicitly that the substance contained 0 traces of cyanide, arsenic, or any traditional lethal agent. Instead, it identified the powder as a highly concentrated synthetic neuroinhibitor. The toxicologist explained that this specific chemical compound was engineered to cross the blood-brain barrier instantly upon ingestion. Its sole physiological purpose was to simulate the exact devastating symptoms of a massive stroke. The victim would lose all motor function, speech capability, and physical autonomy, while their internal consciousness remained entirely intact and perfectly alert. I processed the horrific, cold-blooded brilliance of Gavin's strategy. A sudden, unexplained death in a public steakhouse would have triggered a mandatory police investigation, interrogations, and an automatic, rigorous autopsy. Furthermore, a dead man's estate immediately enters the probate process. Probate is a notoriously slow, bureaucratic nightmare that effectively freezes all corporate and personal assets for months and sometimes years, while the courts meticulously verify the will and settle outstanding debts. Gavin did not have months to wait. He needed absolute immediate liquidity. If I had consumed the tainted wine, I would have collapsed at the table exactly as Naomi did. The emergency room doctors would have diagnosed a catastrophic cerebral event, entirely fooled by the sophisticated synthetic compound. I would have been trapped inside a paralyzed, unresponsive body, fully aware of my surroundings, but utterly incapable of communicating a single word to the outside world. I would be reduced to a living ghost, forced to watch my empire being dismantled right in front of my eyes. Gavin had calculated the exact dosage required to destroy my physical agency, while keeping my heart beating just long enough to serve a very specific, highly lucrative legal purpose. He used his corporate financial background to engineer a flawless, hostile takeover of my life. The realization that my own daughter had willingly poured this nightmare into my glass made my blood run cold. She had smiled at me across the table, knowing she was condemning me to a silent, waking purgatory. I gripped the edge of my desk, steadying my breathing. I had built my logistics company by anticipating every possible failure point on the supply chain. I had navigated treacherous negotiations by understanding the hidden motives of my competitors, but I had never anticipated this level of cruelty inside my own family. Gavin had constructed a flawless trap, turning my own physical body into my prison. The horrific reality of their legal mechanism solidified in my mind. A living, severely incapacitated man requires an emergency legal conservator to manage his daily affairs and financial obligations. As the husband of my only child, Gavin would have confidently stepped into that role, playing the devastated but dutiful son-in-law. With a court-appointed guardianship, Gavin would possess the absolute legal authority to bypass my protective trusts, liquidate my physical assets, and drain the $86 million directly from my open corporate holding accounts. They wanted me alive, a prisoner in my own flesh, while they plundered the fortune I had spent 40 grueling years building from a single rusted delivery truck. I handed the secure tablet back to Jonathan. The empty biometric safe and the distinct scuff mark from the Italian loafer proved that Gavin was not waiting for the legal dust to settle. He was executing a highly accelerated, desperate timeline. Gavin had already secured the physical bearer bonds and the original corporate deeds from my home office, but he still needed the public narrative to hold together seamlessly. That entire narrative depended heavily on the illusion of an accidental medical emergency at the steakhouse. I realized there was a massive gaping hole in Gavin's otherwise perfect crime. Leo. The young waiter had clearly seen Naomi empty the white envelope into my wine glass. He had taken the immense risk to warn me in the hallway. If Gavin reviewed the restaurant events or realized a staff member was lingering too close to our table, he would move to eliminate that catastrophic liability immediately. Gavin possessed the financial resources and the ruthless connections to make a young hospitality worker disappear without a trace. I turned away from the empty vault, my posture rigid with a sudden fierce urgency. I looked at Jonathan and told him we had an incredibly tight, critical window of opportunity. We had to find the young waiter tonight before Gavin's private security team silenced the only independent witness to the conspiracy. Gavin was moving with the frantic energy of a man who knew he was running out of time. He had miscalculated the dosage for Naomi, turning his own wife into a liability, but he would not hesitate to crush anyone else who stood in his path. The $86 million sitting in my holding account was the ultimate prize, and Leo was the one loose thread that could unravel the entire operation. I adjusted my suit jacket and led Jonathan out of the home office. Jonathan drove the armored sedan through the unrelenting rain, navigating away from the manicured lawns of South Park toward the industrial outskirts of Charlotte. The coordinates provided by my private security team led us to a crumbling, low-rent apartment complex bordering an active freight rail yard. The neon sign above the leasing office buzzed erratically, casting harsh red shadows across the cracked pavement. We bypassed the main entrance and located Unit 4B on the ground floor. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, the deadbolt splintered from a previous crude repair. I pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, the cramped living space was in total disarray. Leo, the young waiter from the steakhouse, was frantically shoving a chaotic pile of clothes into a worn canvas duffel bag. He froze instantly as I stepped through the doorway, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He recognized me immediately, his gaze dropping to Jonathan, who stood silently by the door, projecting the unmistakable aura of high-end corporate menace. Leo backed away, his hands raised in a defensive posture, stammering apologies and claiming he had nothing to do with what happened at the restaurant. I held up a hand demanding silence. I told him I did not come for revenge, I came for the truth. I needed to know exactly what he saw and what actions had been taken since the ambulance left. Leo slumped against a cheap laminate counter, the fight draining from his thin frame. His voice trembled as he confessed the events of the past hour. He told me that exactly 45 minutes ago, two men wearing unmarked tailored suits kicked his door open. They did not identify themselves, nor did they display any badges. They threw a thick manila envelope onto his coffee table. It contained $50,000 in sequential unmarked bills. They handed him a legally binding non-disclosure agreement and a one-way plane ticket to Mexico City departing at midnight. They offered a simple ultimatum: take the cash, sign the document, and disappear forever, or refuse and suffer a fatal tragic accident before morning. Leo admitted he was terrified, but he refused to take the money. He possessed a moral compass that Gavin entirely lacked. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. He explained that the steakhouse maintained a blind spot in the service corridor, an area officially unmonitored by management to allow staff a momentary reprieve. However, Leo, anticipating constant theft from the supply room, had installed a hidden motion-activated micro camera disguised as a fire alarm sensor months ago. He had rushed back to the restaurant, accessed the local server, and downloaded the relevant file before Gavin's thugs arrived. He held the drive out to me, his hand shaking. He said he could not live with the guilt of allowing a murder to proceed unchecked. I plugged the USB drive directly into the port on Jonathan's secure tablet. The screen flickered, loading a high-definition video file time-stamped precisely 20 minutes before Naomi collapsed. The angle was slightly elevated, providing a clear, unobstructed view of the service corridor just outside the main dining room. The footage showed Gavin leaning aggressively against the textured wallpaper. Naomi stood rigidly in front of him. The audio was muffled by ambient restaurant noise, but the visual evidence was absolute. The camera captured Gavin reaching into his interior breast pocket. He withdrew a small, unsealed white envelope. He pressed it firmly into Naomi's palm. He leaned down, his face inches from her ear, speaking rapidly, his gestures sharp and commanding. He was issuing explicit final instructions. Naomi nodded, once her expression a mask of cold compliance, and turned to walk back into the dining room. I closed the file, the absolute premeditation of their act searing into my mind. I turned back to Leo. I instructed Jonathan to transfer $100,000 into a secure, untraceable offshore account in Leo's name. I ordered my security team to extract him immediately and place him in a fortified corporate safehouse until the legal fallout settled. Leo grabbed his duffel bag and followed Jonathan's extraction team out the back door. Jonathan and I walked back out into the pouring rain, the evidence of Gavin's treason secured in my pocket. I reached the passenger door of the sedan. At that exact moment, my primary cell phone, the device currently active on the logistics company network, emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. It was a Tier 1 automated alert from my private banking server. The screen displayed a critical security breach warning. Someone was currently executing a sophisticated brute force attack on the digital firewall protecting the primary holding account. The account containing the $68 million from the finalized company sale. Gavin was not waiting for probate. He was initiating a massive, immediate wire transfer. The black sedan slid into the subterranean parking garage of a towering glass high-rise in uptown Charlotte. Jonathan swiped a customized keycard, guiding us past layers of private security until we reached his firm's windowless, soundproofed boardroom. The heavy acoustic doors sealed shut behind us, cutting off the ambient noise of the sleeping city. We stood in a sterile, temperature-controlled environment designed for absolute corporate warfare. Jonathan activated a massive digital display table occupying the center of the room. He bypassed standard corporate firewalls using my absolute founder overrides, granting us unrestricted access to the logistics company's master financial ledgers. I built my empire on microscopic precision. I knew the exact fuel consumption rate of every rig in my fleet and the maintenance schedule of every trailer. I had always applied a ruthless mathematical scrutiny to my competitors, and now I turned that exact same lethal precision directly onto Gavin's tenure as chief financial officer. I remembered hiring him 5 years ago, assuming his pristine Ivy League business degree would modernize our accounting infrastructure. I thought bringing him into the inner circle would provide Naomi with unshakable financial stability. It was a calculated risk that had just mutated into a fatal vulnerability. Jonathan initiated a retroactive forensic audit. This was not a standard quarterly review. It was a brutal algorithmic dissection of every single wire transfer, payroll authorization, and vendor contract Gavin had touched since the day he was handed the keys to the kingdom. We stripped away the polished executive summaries and dove straight into the raw, unedited data streams. Jonathan's proprietary tracking software began highlighting discrepancies in sharp, unforgiving red. At first glance, the corporate books appeared perfectly balanced, reflecting the exact profit margins that had attracted a $68 million buyout. Gavin was incredibly sophisticated. He had not simply siphoned cash from a primary account. He had engineered a massive, heavily disguised crater in the ledgers by bleeding the capital out through thousands of microtransactions. I leaned over the digital display, my eyes catching a pattern in the maintenance logs. Gavin had been authorizing exorbitant repair invoices for a specific class of freight trucks that I had personally decommissioned and sold for scrap 3 years prior. Jonathan unleashed a tracing algorithm on the routing numbers attached to those phantom vendor invoices. The money was being funneled through a dizzying labyrinth of dummy corporations, each posing as independent freight contractors operating out of the Midwest. The digital trail wove through multiple regional banks before finally terminating in a single consolidated account based in Atlanta. The target was a disastrous commercial real estate shell company. Gavin had systematically embezzled exactly $12 million from my logistics firm over the past 24 months. He had used the company I built with my own blood and sweat as his personal unregulated piggy bank to prop up a failing venture that was suffocating under massive, insurmountable debt. He was a terrible investor who had stolen a fortune to cover his own catastrophic failures. The digital calendar glowing in the corner of the boardroom monitor displayed the true, terrifying scope of the crisis. Today was Tuesday. The final comprehensive legal audit for the $68 million corporate acquisition was scheduled for Friday morning. The acquiring conglomerate was sending a team of their most aggressive forensic accountants to finalize the transaction. They would inevitably dive into the deep ledgers and immediately discover the missing $12 million. The entire puzzle of the steakhouse poisoning instantly locked into place. Gavin knew the corporate sale would expose his massive embezzlement and permanently land him in a federal penitentiary. The synthetic neuroinhibitor was not a crime of passion. It was a desperate ticking clock solution to a deadly math problem. By trapping me in a paralyzed, incapacitated body and gaining immediate legal conservatorship over my estate, Gavin planned to seize my personal private wealth. He intended to quietly transfer $12 million of my own money directly back into the corporate holding accounts, silently plugging the massive hole he had created. He would balance the corporate books just hours before the buyers scrutinized them, saving his own skin, while keeping me locked in a silent purgatory. Exposing Gavin to the authorities tonight would trigger a massive federal investigation, instantly freezing all corporate assets as material evidence. The buyers would immediately cancel the acquisition, the value of my logistics fleet would plummet into nothingness, and my entire life's work would be destroyed by public scandal. I stared at the red numbers pulsing on the screen. I could not simply hand my son-in-law over to the police. I had to outmaneuver him. I had to entirely eliminate Gavin from the family and the fortune without leaving a single fingerprint on the company. I stepped out of Jonathan's black sedan into the harsh morning light, leaning heavily on a thick wooden cane I had retrieved from the vehicle. The rain had cleared, leaving the hospital parking lot slick and bright. Every step I took toward the sliding glass doors was a meticulously calculated performance. I hunched my broad shoulders, rolled my knees inward, and let a slight, persistent tremor take over my left hand. I had spent 4 decades cultivating a physical presence that commanded respect in hostile freight yards. Dismantling that posture required intense discipline. I navigated the sterile corridors of the intensive care unit, the rubber tip of the cane squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. I reached the glass-walled observation room holding my daughter. Naomi was awake. The synthetic neuroinhibitor had executed its horrific function flawlessly. It had ravaged her central nervous system. She lay completely flat on the elevated mattress, her body tethered to a bank of blinking monitors. She could not move her arms or legs. Her neck was locked in a rigid forward position. Only her dark eyes darted frantically around the room, wide and dilated with absolute silent terror. Gavin sat perfectly positioned in a plush vinyl chair right beside her bed. He gently held her limp hand, stroking her knuckles with a sickening display of feigned devotion. A young, deeply sympathetic nurse adjusted an intravenous drip, casting sorrowful glances at the tragic young husband. Gavin murmured softly to Naomi, assuring her that everything would be all right. He was playing the role of the heartbroken spouse to absolute perfection. He was actively securing his public alibi, cementing his image as the dedicated caregiver who would soon need to take over the family estate out of sheer necessity. I stood in the doorway, absorbing the profound sociopathy of his performance. He had willingly supplied the catastrophic chemical weapon that paralyzed his wife, and now he was actively mining her trauma for medical sympathy. I tightened my grip on the curved wooden handle of the cane. I had to let him believe he was entirely in control of the narrative. I shuffled forward into the hospital room, intentionally dragging my feet across the floor. Gavin snapped his head up as I crossed the threshold. The performance of the grieving husband vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a raw, undisguised sneer of absolute contempt. He looked at my hunched frame and the wooden cane, completely buying the illusion of my rapid cognitive and physical collapse. He turned immediately to the head nurse, raising his voice so his crisp words would echo into the adjacent hallway. He dramatically sighed, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. He told the nurse that his father-in-law was entirely lost, loudly claiming that I likely did not even know what city I was currently standing in. He painted me as a tragic, bumbling liability who had accidentally caused this entire medical nightmare at the steakhouse. I played along flawlessly. I stopped near the foot of the hospital bed and stared blankly at the white cinder block wall, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I made my eyes intentionally vacant and unfocused. The nurse looked at me with deep pity, whispering to Gavin that the hospital social worker could provide immediate resources for advanced dementia care facilities. Gavin thanked her with a heavy, practiced sorrow, stating he was already exploring emergency legal conservatorship options to protect the family assets from my failing mind. He stood up from his vinyl chair, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, exuding the smug arrogance of a man who believed he had already secured the $86 million prize. He stepped toward the small rolling tray table positioned near my side of the bed. A heavy, thick glass pitcher filled to the brim with ice water rested next to a stack of plastic cups. I waited until Gavin took another step forward, planting his expensive Italian leather loafers firmly on the linoleum floor. I intentionally let my grip on the wooden cane slip. I lunged forward with sudden, clumsy desperation, throwing my entire weight directly into the rolling tray table. The metal edge slammed violently into Gavin's hip. The heavy glass pitcher tipped over and crashed onto the floor. A massive wave of freezing ice water and jagged cubes completely drenched Gavin's tailored trousers and thoroughly soaked his pristine designer shoes. Gavin let out a sharp, furious shout. The freezing water destroyed his carefully curated executive appearance. His temper flared, shattering his calm, sorrowful caregiver facade. He looked down at his ruined leather loafers, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He aggressively cursed under his breath, completely forgetting the sympathetic nurse standing just feet away. He spun around and aggressively demanded that the hospital staff immediately find a janitor to clean up the mess and bring him dry towels. Without waiting for a response, he stormed out of the intensive care unit and marched down the hallway, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the linoleum. The nurse quickly excused herself to grab a mop, leaving the room entirely empty. The heavy electronic door hissed shut behind her. The moment the latch clicked, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. I dropped the wooden cane. It clattered loudly against the floor, but I did not look down. I straightened my spine, shedding the hunched, frail posture instantly. The tremors in my hands stopped. I walked with predatory, silent precision around the edge of the hospital bed. I gripped the cold metal safety railing and leaned over the mattress. I lowered my face until I was inches away from my daughter. Naomi could not move a single muscle, but her dark eyes locked onto mine. She saw the immediate terrifying change in my physical presence. She saw the absolute cold rage burning behind my stare. The mechanical hum of the ventilator filled the tight space between us. I did not yell. I did not express fatherly disappointment. I looked directly into her dilated, terrified pupils. I kept my voice perfectly flat and whispered a single devastating sentence. I said I switched the glasses. Naomi's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. The steady, rhythmic beeping of her digital heart monitor instantly accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched spike. The green line on the screen jagged wildly as her cardiovascular system reacted to the sheer panic flooding her paralyzed body. In that singular, terrifying moment, the reality of her situation crushed her. She realized her husband had abandoned her. She realized the poison in her veins was her own weapon. And she realized the father she had just tried to murder currently held absolute, unchecked power over her entire fate. The rapid, shrill alarm of the heart monitor threatened to bring the entire nursing staff running into the room. Naomi stared at me, her eyes locked in absolute paralyzed terror, as the truth of her situation settled heavily onto her chest. I did not possess the luxury of time to watch her process her own treason. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and extracted a secondary untraceable burner phone Jonathan had secured for me. The screen was already unlocked. I leaned closer to her face, my voice remaining perfectly level and devoid of any paternal warmth. I told her she had exactly one opportunity to explain her actions and save herself from federal prison. I slid the sleek black device beneath the edge of her hospital pillow, positioning it directly beside her right hand where she retained a fraction of motor control. I instructed her to type when she was entirely alone. The heavy electronic door hissed as it began to open. I instantly broke our eye contact. I grabbed the curved wooden handle of my cane from the linoleum floor and violently slumped my shoulders forward. The cold, calculating executive vanished instantly, replaced by the frail, bewildered old man. Gavin stormed back into the intensive care unit, clutching a thick stack of brown paper towels. His face remained flushed with residual fury as he aggressively scrubbed at the water stains soaking his designer Italian loafers. He glared at me with raw hatred, entirely convinced that my clumsy, dementia-riddled mind had ruined his appearance. He ordered me to leave the hospital immediately, citing my sheer incompetence and demanding I return to the South Park estate before I caused another disaster. I nodded blankly, shuffling my feet across the floor as I turned away from the bed. I did not look back at Naomi. I navigated the bright, sterile corridors and exited through the main sliding doors into the cool night air. Jonathan's armored black sedan sat idling by the curb. I climbed into the back seat, and we departed immediately, leaving Gavin to play his tragic role. We drove straight back to the windowless, soundproofed boardroom at Jonathan's downtown firm. The massive digital display table remained illuminated with the forensic evidence of Gavin's $12 million embezzlement. I sat at the head of the dark oak table, poured a glass of black coffee, and waited for the inevitable message. Deep into the night, the silence of the corporate boardroom remained absolute. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 2 a.m. I sat completely still, watching the glowing financial ledgers that detailed Gavin's massive corporate theft. The sleek burner phone resting on the polished oak table finally vibrated, emitting a short, sharp buzz. I picked up the device. The incoming text messages arrived in fractured, erratic bursts. The severe motor impairment caused by the synthetic neuroinhibitor made typing an agonizing, monumental effort for Naomi. Letters were scrambled, spaces were missed, but the core narrative formed a clear, undeniable confession. She wrote that she never intended to cause permanent harm. She claimed Gavin had systematically manipulated her over the past 8 months. He had fabricated a compelling narrative, convincing her that my mind was rapidly deteriorating. He presented forged internal emails suggesting the acquiring conglomerate was preparing to cancel the $68 million buyout due to my supposed erratic leadership. Gavin had positioned himself as the reluctant savior of our family legacy. Naomi explained the white envelope. She typed that Gavin had provided the powder just moments before we sat down at the steakhouse. He promised her the substance was merely a heavy, fast-acting sedative imported from a private clinic in Europe. According to his lie, the drug would simply induce a temporary, highly visible state of extreme lethargy. Gavin insisted this public medical episode was absolutely necessary to force me into an immediate mandatory medical retirement. He swore that gaining legal conservatorship was the only way to bypass my authority and finalize the corporate sale before the buyers withdrew their offer. Naomi believed she was executing a harsh but necessary intervention to protect my life's work from my own failing mind. She truly thought I would wake up the next morning groggy but entirely unharmed, safely removed from the corporate hierarchy. She admitted she poured the powder into my Cabernet out of a twisted sense of family loyalty manipulated by a husband who exploited her deepest fears regarding our financial security. I read the disjointed paragraphs, processing the sheer depth of Gavin's psychological control. He had weaponized a daughter's concern against her own father, turning her into an unwitting assassin to cover up his $12 million embezzlement crater. He needed her to pull the trigger so his own hands would remain entirely clean from the crime. I did not reply with sympathy. I did not offer parental reassurance. I maintained the cold, analytical precision that had built my empire. I opened the encrypted file containing the private toxicologist's report on Jonathan's tablet. I took a high-definition screenshot of the chemical breakdown, specifically highlighting the synthetic neuroinhibitor's physiological effects and the massive concentration levels found in the linen napkin. I transmitted the terrifying image directly to Naomi's concealed burner phone. I followed the image with a single, unyielding paragraph of text. I explicitly detailed the mathematical reality of Gavin's betrayal. The powder inside that white envelope was never a sedative. The dosage Gavin had calculated was absolutely catastrophic. It was not designed to make a healthy 69-year-old man simply fall asleep. It was precisely engineered to induce total, irreversible brain death while leaving the heart functioning just long enough to activate a legal conservatorship. I explained the sheer toxicity of the compound she had ingested. Gavin knew exactly how lethal the substance was. When I switched the glasses and Naomi consumed the neuroinhibitor, Gavin instantly recognized the failure of his primary objective. Yet he did not intervene. He watched his wife collapse and immediately pivoted to a secondary strategy. If the massive dosage proved fatal to her, Gavin was fully prepared to pin the blame entirely on my supposed dementia. He would have tearfully testified that my deteriorating mind led me to accidentally drop lethal medication into her glass. He intended to sacrifice her life to secure his absolute control over my estate. He had actively planned to use her as a sacrificial lamb the moment his original assassination attempt failed. The digital indicator on the messaging application showed that Naomi was typing. The delay stretched for several agonizing minutes as she absorbed the clinical, indisputable proof that her husband had casually factored her death into his corporate heist. The profound manipulation shattered, leaving only the raw, brutal truth of her situation. She was lying paralyzed in an intensive care unit because she had trusted a predator. The burner phone vibrated against the oak table one final time. The incoming message did not contain excuses, apologies, or pleas for forgiveness. The erratic, panicked typing had vanished, replaced by a cold, singular focus. The final message simply read, "Burn him." The pale light of early morning broke across the manicured grounds of my South Park estate. I sat on the expansive stone patio holding a mug of bitter black coffee. The two-word message from Naomi still burned brightly in my mind. Her directive to burn the man who had paralyzed her stripped away the last microscopic trace of familial hesitation I harbored. I watched the heavy iron security gates at the end of the long driveway. The intercom on the stone pillar buzzed sharply, shattering the morning silence. My private security detail stationed at the perimeter informed me a legal courier was demanding immediate access. I pressed the authorization button on my phone, instructing the guards to let the man walk up the driveway alone. I remained seated as a nervous young man in a cheap windbreaker approached the patio. He clutched a thick stack of manila folders tightly against his chest. He hesitated at the edge of the stone pavers, clearly intimidated by the sheer scale of the property and the cold, unblinking stare I fixed upon him. He took a hesitant step forward and asked if I was Jonathan Dawson. I did not verbally confirm. I simply extended my right hand. He quickly shoved the heavy legal documents into my grasp, muttered a mandated legal greeting, and practically sprinted back down the driveway. I set my coffee mug down and broke the red seal on the primary folder. The cover page bore the harsh official crest of the county family court. Gavin had officially filed a petition for emergency and voluntary conservatorship over my person and my entire estate. He was executing his hostile takeover in broad daylight, utilizing the justice system as his primary weapon. I flipped through the densely packed pages of legal jargon. Gavin was moving with terrifying speed, attempting to legally erase my autonomy before the corporate buyout finalized on Friday. He wanted a judge to hand him the keys to the $86 million by Friday morning. Jonathan arrived exactly 20 minutes later, walking through the glass patio doors with his secure tablet tucked under his arm. He took the seat opposite me and immediately began dissecting the emergency filing. Gavin had employed a highly aggressive legal strategy known as an ex parte petition. This maneuver was specifically designed to bypass standard legal notification periods by arguing that a delay would result in catastrophic immediate harm. Jonathan read Gavin's sworn statement aloud. My son-in-law argued that he required the immediate unconditional transfer of all my financial authority to manage the exorbitant specialized medical expenses of his poisoned wife. Gavin had the absolute sociopathic audacity to cite Naomi's tragic accident as the primary justification for seizing my wealth. He explicitly claimed in the court documents that my rapidly deteriorating cognitive state had caused me to accidentally mix lethal medications into my daughter's wine glass. He framed himself as the desperate, devoted husband stepping up to manage a devastating family crisis caused by my supposed dementia. To secure an emergency conservatorship without my presence in court, Gavin needed irrefutable medical proof of my incompetence. Jonathan pulled the final document from the manila folder. It was a sworn medical affidavit bearing the official stamp of a private neurological physician. The affidavit detailed a comprehensive diagnostic examination that never actually occurred. The doctor falsely certified that I suffered from advanced unmanageable Alzheimer's disease, characterizing me as a severe danger to myself and my family. The clinical descriptions were terrifyingly precise, detailing violent mood swings, memory blackouts, and a total inability to manage basic financial concepts. Gavin had constructed a flawless paper reality where I was already a ghost. Jonathan laid the fraudulent affidavit flat on the stone table and aimed the camera of his tablet at the physician's signature block. He ran the printed medical license number directly through his encrypted legal database. The scanning software hummed quietly for a few seconds before generating a stark red alert on the screen. Jonathan smiled a cold, ruthless expression that promised absolute ruin. He turned the tablet to face me. The database revealed the true identity of Gavin's star medical witness. The signature belonged to a disgraced physician who had been permanently stripped of his medical credentials 2 years ago by the state medical board. The man had been federally indicted for severe prescription fraud and operating illegal pill mills out of his private practice. He was entirely banned from practicing medicine or signing any legal health directives. Gavin was moving with such frantic desperation to cover his $12 million corporate embezzlement that he made a catastrophic, unforced error. He could not risk hiring a legitimate doctor who would demand an actual physical examination of my mental state. Instead, he utilized his dark corporate connections to purchase a black market medical affidavit from a desperate criminal. Gavin was utilizing forged legal documents to steal my empire. Jonathan tapped the screen, highlighting the official court summons attached to the back of the petition. The emergency hearing was set to take place in a closed judge's chamber in exactly 48 hours. The ticking clock was deafening. If we walked into that courtroom and simply presented defensive evidence, the judge might order a prolonged independent medical evaluation. A lengthy legal battle would instantly become public record. The acquiring conglomerate would see the litigation freeze the company assets and walk away from the $68 million sale. I could not simply defend myself against Gavin. I had to utterly destroy his credibility and expose his murderous intent without dragging the company into a public courtroom spectacle. I looked at Jonathan and told him we were not going to fight Gavin in court. We were going to bypass the legal system entirely. I realized I had to lay a final psychological trap. I had to force my son-in-law into a corner so tight he would have no choice but to deliver a live, undeniable confession before the sun rose tomorrow. I gripped my primary cell phone, the device Gavin believed was my only tether to the outside world. I stared at the dark screen, mentally dismantling the ruthless executive persona I had worn for 40 years. I needed to become the exact pathetic, broken man described in Gavin's fraudulent medical affidavit. I dialed his private number. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice clipped and impatient, annoyed by the intrusion. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my voice waver, injecting a high, reedy panic into my tone. I told him I was sitting in the kitchen and could not remember how I got there. I begged him to come to the estate immediately. I stammered, claiming the power company was threatening to shut off the electricity and I could not locate my leather checkbook. I pleaded with him, my voice cracking, asking for his help to simply keep the lights on. The shift in Gavin's demeanor was instantaneous. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiated through the cellular connection. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, playing the role of the burdened caregiver, even when no one else was listening. He told me to stay exactly where I was, and not to touch anything, speaking to me as if I were a severely impaired toddler. He promised he would drive over to handle the bills. He ended the call without saying goodbye. I lowered the phone. The physical act of begging my son-in-law for help tasted like battery acid, but it was absolutely necessary. Gavin was riding an adrenaline high of unchecked corporate theft and perceived dominance. He believed his engineered reality was manifesting perfectly. He thought the stress of Naomi's paralysis had finally shattered my aging mind, rendering the fake medical documents practically prophetic. I had given him the ultimate bait. An incapacitated, terrified old man sitting alone in a massive estate, practically begging to surrender control of his daily life. Gavin was coming to claim his throne, entirely unaware he was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. The moment the call ended, the South Park estate transformed into a synchronized tactical staging ground. Jonathan did not waste a single second. He summoned his elite private security team, a ghost unit of former intelligence operatives who operated entirely outside the logistics company's payroll. They moved through my expansive living room with silent, terrifying efficiency. They systematically wired the entire space, transforming the luxurious mahogany-paneled room into a flawless digital trap. A technician in a matte black uniform carefully removed several thick leather-bound first editions from the towering bookshelves, replacing them with hollowed-out replicas housing high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras. Another operative slid beneath the massive glass and oak coffee table, adhering military-grade omnidirectional microphones directly to the underside of the heavy wood. They synced the surveillance feeds to a secure, encrypted server hosted on Jonathan's customized tablet. Every visual angle was covered. Every whisper would be captured in crystal-clear audio. Once the equipment was armed and verified, the security team vanished out the back service doors, leaving no physical trace of their presence. Jonathan retreated into the adjacent formal dining room, slipping behind the heavy velvet curtains to monitor the live digital feed in total darkness. I was left entirely alone in the center of the living room. I moved toward my oversized leather armchair, the seat positioned perfectly within the intersection of 3 separate camera angles. I sank into the deep cushions and reached for a thick woven cashmere blanket draped over the sofa. I pulled the heavy fabric tightly across my lap and tucked the edges under my knees, completing the visual illusion of a frail, freezing old man succumbing to rapid cognitive decline. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my chest to diminish my physical presence. I slowed my breathing and fixed my gaze on the empty fireplace. I had built an empire by anticipating the weaknesses of my corporate rivals, exploiting their greed and their blind spots. Gavin's ultimate blind spot was his own staggering ego. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he had outsmarted a logistics baron, outmaneuvered the legal system, and successfully crippled his own wife without consequence. I sat perfectly still under the hidden lenses, waiting for the predator to step into the snare. Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble foyer before Gavin pushed through the double doors of the living room. He did not knock. He strutted into my home with the wide, arrogant stride of a conquering king claiming his conquered territory. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his expression practically glowing with smug, unchecked superiority. He looked down at me, huddled beneath the cashmere blanket in the armchair, and let out a sharp, derisive scoff. He asked mockingly if I had managed to remember my own name while waiting for him. I kept my eyes wide and fearful, allowing a severe tremor to shake my right hand. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. I held it out to him with a pathetic, trembling desperation. I told him my mind was slipping away faster than I could control. I claimed the paper contained the master alphanumeric passcodes to my private offshore trust accounts. I begged him to take the codes, asking for only one condition in return. I pleaded with him to promise he would use the funds to take care of Naomi. Gavin snatched the paper from my shaking fingers and burst into cruel, genuine laughter. He stood directly over the hidden microphones, waving the paper in my face. He gleefully informed me that he did not need my permission or my pathetic bargains. He openly bragged about emptying the biometric wall safe in my study days ago, securing the bearer bonds and the original corporate deeds while I was busy panicking at the hospital. He laughed at my sheer stupidity, explicitly detailing how easy it was to hire a disgraced black market doctor to forge the Alzheimer's affidavit. He paced the room, his ego demanding an audience for his brilliant treason. He clearly stated his plan to finalize the emergency conservatorship paperwork and legally lock me inside a state-run psychiatric facility by Monday morning. He proudly admitted he had orchestrated the entire scenario, treating Naomi's paralysis as a convenient, necessary collateral damage to secure the $12 million he desperately needed to cover his corporate theft. The hidden high-definition cameras captured every single syllable of his flawless, uninterrupted confession. Gavin smiled down at me, entirely convinced he had won the war. He did not realize he had just provided the exact ammunition required to execute his total destruction. Gavin pushed through the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate, his chest puffed out with the exhilarating rush of absolute victory. He marched down the sweeping stone driveway, his Italian leather loafers striking the pavement with aggressive, confident precision. He did not even wait to return to his own upscale neighborhood. The sheer intoxicating magnitude of the $86 million sitting just keystrokes away consumed his entire rational mind. He reached his sleek silver luxury sedan parked just beyond the main security gates and threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut to seal himself inside a private sanctuary of greed. He tossed the folded piece of heavy stock paper onto the passenger seat like a conquered flag. His hands moved with frantic, trembling energy as he reached into the back seat and retrieved his brushed aluminum laptop from his leather briefcase. He flipped the screen open, the bright digital glow illuminating his flushed, triumphant face in the darkened cabin of the vehicle. He bypassed the standard local network and quickly connected the device to a secure encrypted mobile hotspot, ensuring his digital footprint remained isolated from the estate's primary servers. He rapidly navigated through a series of complex login protocols until he reached the primary holding portal for the logistics company's finalized corporate sale. The screen displayed a blank authorization field, demanding the ultimate security clearance to access the liquid capital. Gavin picked up the piece of paper Dawson had surrendered so pathetically just minutes prior. He stared at the handwritten alphanumeric sequence, his lips curling into a wicked, predatory smile. He firmly believed he had outmaneuvered a titan of industry, successfully weaponizing a daughter and exploiting an old man's supposed cognitive decay. He placed his fingers over the illuminated keyboard and eagerly typed the exact sequence of letters and numbers, fully expecting the digital vault to swing wide open and surrender its contents to his absolute control. He hit the primary execution key with a sharp, decisive strike. The interface absorbed the command, displaying a spinning loading icon that reflected in Gavin's dilated pupils. He did not exhale. He waited for the familiar sterile green dashboard of the primary ledger to materialize. The system seemingly accepted the credentials, routing him directly to the central wire transfer terminal. Gavin's breathing turned shallow and rapid. He wasted zero time navigating the interface. He immediately began inputting the deeply concealed routing numbers and international SWIFT codes connected to his failing real estate shell company based in Atlanta. This was the exact phantom entity he had utilized to siphon $12 million from the corporate accounts over the past 2 years. He entered the staggering numerical value required to not only cover his massive embezzlement crater, but to completely drain the holding account of its remaining funds, leaving Dawson entirely destitute. He intended to gut the empire completely before the corporate buyers arrived for their Friday audit. He double-checked the account numbers, his mind already racing forward to the life of unchecked luxury waiting for him once the transaction cleared. He envisioned his father-in-law locked in a sterile psychiatric ward, entirely stripped of his assets and his dignity while he reigned over the stolen fortune. He moved the cursor directly over the final flashing authorization button at the bottom of the screen. He applied pressure to the trackpad, executing the massive financial transfer. He leaned back against the plush leather headrest, waiting for the final digital confirmation of his ultimate triumph. The screen did not transition to a successful completion receipt. Instead, the interface violently shuddered. The soft, calming blue and white corporate colors instantly vanished. The entire display flashed a brilliant, uncompromising, and deeply alarming crimson red. Gavin shot forward, gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for a physical impact. He furiously tapped the trackpad, attempting to refresh the browser or cancel the outgoing command. The laptop remained entirely unresponsive. The piece of paper Dawson had handed him did not contain a master access key. It was a highly classified Tier 1 corporate duress code established by Jonathan years ago, specifically designed for extreme hostage scenarios. The moment Gavin executed the transfer command, the duress code instantly triggered a total, irreversible system freeze. A stark, black terminal window materialized violently across the center of the crimson screen, populated by rapidly scrolling lines of white code. Gavin watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the system systematically dismantled his digital anonymity. The software explicitly listed his secure mobile hotspot, instantly bypassing his encrypted virtual private network to lock down his exact unshielded IP address. A secondary window flashed, displaying his precise real-time GPS coordinates parked just outside the South Park estate. A final blaring text box anchored itself to the center of the display. It confirmed that an automated high-priority emergency alert had just been successfully transmitted directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division. The notification explicitly detailed an active, highly sophisticated, and unauthorized wire fraud attempt exceeding $50 million. The sheer scale of the financial threshold triggered an immediate mandatory federal response protocol. The blood completely drained from Gavin's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His breathing hitched in his throat, transforming into a sharp, suffocating gasp. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon his chest with the weight of an anvil. He stared at the locked, glowing red screen, the magnitude of his fatal miscalculation shattering his towering ego. The trembling hands, the confused stares, the pathetic surrender of the checkbook, none of it was real. The old man had never lost his mind. Dawson had orchestrated a flawless theatrical performance, luring him to the estate to willingly deliver an unprompted recorded confession, and then personally handing him the exact digital weapon required to trigger a federal trap. Gavin realized he was sitting alone in his luxury sedan, hopelessly chained to a massive federal crime, while the man he tried to murder held all the keys. The blinding red warning screen of the laptop reflected in Gavin's wide, terrified eyes, illuminating the exact moment his entire constructed reality shattered. He violently shoved the brushed aluminum device off his lap, sending it crashing into the passenger side floorboard of his luxury sedan. He slammed his Italian leather loafer onto the accelerator with ruthless force. The heavy tires screeched against the wet pavement of the estate driveway, fishtailing wildly for a chaotic second before gripping the asphalt and tearing out onto the main suburban road. Panic, raw and unadulterated, entirely consumed his rational mind. The sophisticated Ivy League financial officer vanished into the humid morning air, replaced instantly by a cornered, desperate animal. He knew with absolute certainty that the federal authorities were already actively pinging his vehicle's location. The Tier 1 duress code had locked his unshielded IP address and transmitted his precise GPS coordinates directly to the Cybercrimes Division in Washington. Every traffic light camera, every automated toll scanner, and every municipal surveillance feed he passed was actively building a digital net around his escape route. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow gasps as he navigated the morning commuter traffic with reckless, erratic aggression, swerving violently between delivery trucks and civilian vehicles. His meticulously constructed plan was entirely dead. The $12 million embezzlement crater was now a blazing beacon fully exposed to both federal investigators and the acquiring conglomerate's forensic accountants. His offshore accounts in Atlanta were permanently frozen. His lucrative corporate buyout was ash, and his freedom was evaporating by the second. The calculated poisoning at the steakhouse, the forged medical documents from the disgraced physician, the theatrical performance in the intensive care unit had all culminated in a catastrophic, federally mandated trap. He gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned entirely white, his mind frantically searching for a single remaining shred of leverage in a game he had definitively lost. He possessed zero financial assets and absolutely no legal authority over the Dawson estate. The only piece on the board he could still physically manipulate was the very woman he had paralyzed. He needed a high-value hostage. He needed the one thing Dawson valued significantly more than his logistics empire. Gavin violently wrenched the steering wheel to the right, abandoning the highway route and accelerating directly toward the downtown medical center. Gavin abandoned his vehicle entirely haphazardly in the hospital's emergency drop-off zone, leaving the driver's side door swinging open and the engine still idling loudly against the curb. He sprinted through the automatic glass doors of the main entrance, his charcoal suit jacket flaring behind him, his silk tie hanging loose and crooked against his collar. The crisp, polished executive demeanor was completely obliterated by sweat, heavy breathing, and sheer frantic terror. He aggressively bypassed the main reception desk, entirely ignoring the startled shouts of the morning administrative staff and the blaring security warnings. He vaulted up the central concrete stairwell, taking the steps two at a time, his expensive shoes echoing harshly against the walls. He burst through the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit just as the nursing staff was transitioning through their mandatory morning shift change. The brief, chaotic overlap of medical personnel discussing charts at the central station provided the exact tactical window he desperately needed. He marched straight into Naomi's private room and slammed the heavy, solid-core wooden door shut behind him. He instantly threw his entire body weight against the frame and engaged the internal manual deadbolt, securing the locking mechanism with a sharp, echoing metallic snap. He turned slowly to face the hospital bed. Naomi lay exactly as she had been left, a silent prisoner inside her own paralyzed flesh. But her dark eyes widened with renewed profound horror as she registered the manic, unhinged violence radiating from her husband. Gavin moved to the side of the mattress, his chest heaving rapidly, his eyes darting frantically around the sterile space looking for any tactical advantage. He noticed the slight, unnatural elevation of her standard-issue pillow. He shoved his hand roughly beneath the white linen and pulled out the sleek black burner phone Dawson had hidden there hours ago. The realization that his father-in-law had already established a secure, undetected line of communication with his paralyzed wife sent a fresh, sickening surge of adrenaline through his veins. He swiped the illuminated screen, found the single programmed contact number designated for Dawson, and hit the call button. He paced the short length of the hospital room like a caged predator waiting for the connection to establish. When the line finally clicked open, Gavin did not attempt to negotiate calmly or maintain his corporate facade. He unleashed a frantic, high-pitched scream into the receiver, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his ruined life. Gavin shrieked his terrifying demands into the burner phone, his words tumbling out in a manic, desperate rush that echoed against the sterile walls of the hospital room. He marched over to the stainless steel medical cart positioned near the vital sign monitors and grabbed a sealed, plastic-wrapped syringe. He ripped the sterile packaging open with his teeth, spat the plastic onto the floor, and pulled the internal plunger back deliberately, filling the empty cylindrical chamber with pure atmospheric air. He held the sharp medical instrument directly over Naomi's exposed intravenous line, his hand shaking violently with uncontained panic. He explicitly detailed the lethal physics of his intended action, screaming into the phone that a massive injection of empty air directly into her bloodstream would instantly travel to her brain, causing an immediate catastrophic and fatal embolism. He laid out a final, absolute, non-negotiable ultimatum. He demanded that Dawson instantly contact the international banking authorities, completely lift the catastrophic security freeze on the corporate holding accounts, and officially withdraw his legal contest to the emergency conservatorship petition currently sitting in family court. Gavin swore with vicious, tearful intensity that he would depress the plunger and stop Naomi's heart forever if Dawson did not legally surrender the logistics empire within the next 60 seconds. The tense, suffocating silence stretched agonizingly across the cellular connection. Dawson did not yell in response. He did not plead for his only daughter's life. He did not offer a single monetary concession or attempt a desperate emotional negotiation. The logistical titan maintained an absolute, terrifying calm. Dawson's voice transmitted through the tiny speaker perfectly flat, cold, and chillingly precise. He simply informed his frantic son-in-law that he did not need to imagine the horrific scene unfolding in the hospital room because he was looking directly at him right now. Gavin froze instantly, the deadly syringe hovering just millimeters above the plastic IV port, his eyes darting wildly toward the dark corners of the acoustic ceiling tiles. Dawson was not sitting helplessly in the mahogany-paneled living room of the South Park estate. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with the head of hospital security inside the centralized control room on the ground floor, staring directly at a bank of high-definition surveillance monitors tracking the intensive care unit. Dawson stated clearly that he had already anticipated this exact violent escalation. He pressed a single glowing red icon on the administrative security console keyboard. The heavy electronic deadbolt securing the wooden door of the intensive care unit emitted a loud, harsh mechanical clack as Dawson remotely overrode the lock, throwing the room wide open to the forces waiting in the hallway. The heavy electronic doors of the intensive care unit slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss that cut through the sterile silence of the room. Gavin spun around, his meticulously tailored suit twisting awkwardly around his frame as raw panic replaced his arrogant fury. The deadly plastic syringe slipped from his trembling, sweat-slicked fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the polished linoleum floor and rolling beneath the stainless steel medical cart. Before he could even process the sudden breach of his isolated sanctuary, two massive figures stepped through the threshold. They were not hospital security guards in cheap polyester uniforms. They were heavily armed off-duty tactical police officers, retained exclusively through Jonathan's deep network of private contractors, and they moved with terrifying, uncompromising speed. Gavin barely had time to raise his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. The lead officer lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Gavin by the lapels of his charcoal suit jacket and violently slammed him against the corridor wall. The impact rattled the framed medical credentials hanging nearby and forced a sharp, agonizing gasp from Gavin's lungs. The second officer moved in absolute synchronization, seizing Gavin's flailing right wrist and wrenching it sharply behind his back with enough force to threaten a dislocation. They pinned him face first against the cold, unyielding drywall, expertly neutralizing his leverage and completely immobilizing his frantic movements. Gavin's cheek was pressed brutally against the painted surface, his expensive silk tie crushed against his throat. The officers did not issue standard police warnings or read him his rights. They operated entirely off the books, their sole objective to secure the room and physically separate the predator from his paralyzed prey. Naomi lay completely still in her hospital bed, her dark eyes tracking the sudden explosion of tactical violence with an expression of profound, silent relief. The immediate threat of the lethal air embolism had vanished, replaced by the crushing physical subjugation of the man who had confidently planned to extinguish her life. Gavin kicked his Italian leather loafers against the floorboards, attempting to gain purchase, but the officers simply drove their weight harder into his spine, pressing the air from his lungs. His absolute control over the narrative, the environment, and the victims had been entirely stripped away in a matter of seconds, leaving him pinned, helpless, and gasping for breath under the crushing weight of Jonathan's invisible security apparatus. Trapped against the wall, Gavin instinctively reverted to the only strategy he had left. He weaponized his perceived status, shifting instantly from an exposed criminal to a horrified, persecuted victim. He thrashed his shoulders against the overwhelming weight of the officers, twisting his neck to scream down the brightly lit corridor. He bellowed that he was being brutally assaulted without provocation, demanding immediate assistance from the medical staff. His voice ripped through the quiet ward, a frantic, hysterical pitch designed to draw maximum attention. He shrieked that he was a devoted husband violently attacked by rogue security while simply trying to comfort his critically ill, paralyzed wife. The sheer volume of his performance triggered an immediate response from the surrounding hospital infrastructure. A pair of senior administrators clad in crisp white coats and holding digital tablets sprinted down the hallway with a flock of startled nurses trailing closely behind them. They halted abruptly at the entrance to Naomi's room, their eyes wide with shock at the sight of the prominent executive physically subdued by tactical personnel. Gavin saw his audience and amplified his desperate theater. He locked eyes with the lead administrator, his face flushed and contorted into a mask of pure victimized outrage. He demanded the immediate arrest of the two men restraining him, loudly accusing them of orchestrating an illegal targeted kidnapping on hospital grounds. He invoked his corporate title, his supposed wealth, and his legal right to be at his wife's bedside, threatening catastrophic lawsuits against the entire medical center for allowing armed mercenaries to infiltrate an intensive care unit. The administrators exchanged panicked, uncertain glances, reaching for their communication radios to summon the official hospital police liaison. Gavin pushed his advantage, twisting his face to project righteous indignation, insisting that his father-in-law had lost his mind and dispatched thugs to murder him. He wove a frantic narrative of a desperate family man fighting against a senile patriarch's delusions. He demanded the nurses check Naomi's vitals loudly, asserting that the stress of this violent intrusion could trigger a fatal cardiac event. He played the role of the terrified spouse with flawless sociopathic precision, calculating that the sheer administrative terror of a massive liability lawsuit would force the hospital staff to intervene and release him from the physical hold. He breathed heavily against the drywall, entirely convinced his silver-tongued manipulation was about to secure his escape from the tactical snare. The quiet chime of the intensive care unit's central elevator subtly pierced through the chaotic shouting. The polished steel doors slid open and I stepped out onto the ward. I did not walk with a cane. I did not shuffle my feet, nor did I hunch my shoulders in a display of cognitive decay. I moved with the heavy, undeniable presence of a man who had built a logistics empire from the ground up. The tailored lines of my dark suit framed an expression of absolute Arctic calm. The panicked administrators instinctively parted, stepping aside to clear a path as I approached the scene. I walked directly past Gavin, completely ignoring his frantic, muffled shouts and the desperate thrashing of his pinned body. I did not even grant him the dignity of eye contact. I stopped in front of the primary nurse's station desk, reaching inside my breast pocket to retrieve a crisply folded, heavy stock document bearing a brilliant red judicial seal. I dropped the paperwork onto the center of the desk, the sharp smack of the paper silencing the chaotic murmurs of the medical staff. It was a formal, expedited domestic terror injunction. Guided step by step by Jonathan's encrypted instructions over the burner phone, Naomi had spent the last hour painfully typing out an official, legally binding, sworn declaration of an immediate and lethal threat. The document had been electronically transmitted, reviewed, and signed by a superior court judge before Gavin had even parked his car in the emergency drop-off zone. I looked at the lead hospital administrator and instructed him to read the judicial order aloud. The mandate was absolute and aggressively uncompromising. Gavin was legally classified as an active lethal threat to his wife and was strictly barred from coming within 500 feet of Naomi the hospital or any property associated with my estate. The injunction immediately stripped him of all spousal medical proxy rights, permanently severing his legal tether to the woman he had tried to weaponize. Gavin heard the legal ruling echo down the hallway, the final remnants of his arrogant facade crumbling into genuine hollow terror. He realized the paralyzed victim he had mocked had orchestrated his total legal banishment from a hospital bed. I nodded once to the off-duty officers. They seamlessly shifted their grips, hauling Gavin roughly off his feet. They dragged him backward down the polished corridor, his expensive loafers scraping uselessly against the linoleum as he was physically expelled from the empire he had tried to steal. The blinding morning sunlight cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the uptown Charlotte high-rise offered zero warmth to the tense atmosphere inside the conglomerate's executive boardroom. The acquiring directors sat in high-backed leather chairs, their expressions forming a collective mask of corporate impatience and severe agitation. The sudden, unexplained federal freeze on a $68 million acquisition required immediate, satisfactory answers. Gavin pushed through the heavy glass doors, his appearance a stark, jarring contrast to his normally immaculate presentation. The bespoke charcoal suit he wore was deeply creased and ruined from his violent physical expulsion from the hospital corridor the previous night. He had spent the agonizing dawn hours desperately trying to salvage his shattered reality, clinging blindly to the only piece of leverage he believed he still possessed. He clutched a thick leather portfolio tightly against his side, guarding the fraudulent medical affidavit and the ex parte conservatorship petition as if they were holy relics. He took a seat near the head of the massive oak table, arranging his papers with frantic, trembling hands. He looked at the circle of expectant, irritated executives and immediately deployed his final desperate narrative. He adopted a tone of profound manufactured sorrow, manipulating his voice to sound exhausted and heartbroken. He informed the board that a severe, unforeseen family tragedy had unfolded over the past 48 hours. He claimed that the immense, crushing stress of the pending merger had triggered a catastrophic and irreversible mental collapse in his father-in-law. He explicitly stated that Dawson was currently under strict closed medical supervision for advanced dementia and was entirely legally incapable of executing his duties as the chief executive officer. Gavin positioned himself as the reluctant but absolutely necessary savior of the transaction. He assured the acquiring directors that as the chief financial officer, he held the definitive legal authority to bypass Dawson's compromised state and finalize the lucrative buyout immediately. He slid the forged medical documents across the polished wood, presenting them as irrefutable proof of his tragic ascension to ultimate power. He desperately needed them to sign the final transfer authorizations before the federal authorities unraveled his $12 million embezzlement. His entire survival depended on finalizing the transaction within this exact room, projecting an aura of total control while standing directly on a collapsing trapdoor. The lead director of the conglomerate tapped his gold pen against the oak table, his brow deeply furrowed in severe skepticism. He demanded a precise, granular explanation for the massive, unauthorized wire transfer attempt and the subsequent federal lockdown of the corporate holding accounts that had alerted their legal team at midnight. Gavin did not flinch, leaning forward to spin a masterful, tragic lie. He insisted the frozen funds were merely a catastrophic banking error directly caused by Dawson's rapidly deteriorating cognitive state. He painted a vivid, disturbing picture of a confused, senile old man blindly mashing keys on a secure terminal, accidentally triggering federal security protocols while experiencing a severe paranoid delusion. Gavin promised the board that his elite legal team was already interfacing with the international bank to lift the restriction, guaranteeing the $68 million would be cleanly routed and readily available by the end of the business day. He raised his hands in a gesture of absolute calming reassurance, urging them to proceed with the final signatures to prevent the deal from collapsing entirely. The heavy double oak doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open with a resounding, undeniable crash. The hushed executive conversation died instantly. Gavin turned his head, the manufactured sorrow freezing permanently on his face. I stepped across the threshold. I did not lean on the curved wooden handle of a cane. I did not shuffle my feet, nor did I drop my shoulders into a pathetic posture of defeat. I had left the props of my feigned vulnerability in the hallway. I strode into the room dressed in a sharply tailored bespoke navy suit, my posture rigid, my gaze carrying the Arctic ruthless precision that had built my logistics empire from absolute nothing. The frail, bewildered old man from the hospital and the patio was entirely dead and buried. I moved with undeniable kinetic authority, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, commanding the space without uttering a single syllable. The executives around the table instinctively sat up straighter, adjusting their ties and registering the sheer dominant energy radiating from my sudden presence. I did not look at Gavin. I did not acknowledge the frantic, pathetic stammering that suddenly erupted from his throat as his perfect, tragic narrative disintegrated right in front of his eyes. I walked the entire length of the boardroom, my focus locked entirely on the empty leather chair at the absolute head of the table. I claimed the high-backed leather chair, settling into the seat with the absolute certainty of a monarch reclaiming his stolen throne. Gavin stood frozen just 3 feet away, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, physically paralyzed by the impossible reality of my arrival. He looked exactly like a man watching the solid ground disappear entirely beneath his feet. I reached into my slim leather briefcase and extracted a thick, meticulously organized dossier bound in heavy black leather. I did not offer any dramatic monologues. I did not raise my voice or shout emotional accusations. I simply slid the heavy binder across the polished wood directly into the hands of the conglomerate's lead director. I calmly instructed him to review the contents thoroughly before authorizing a single cent of the buyout. The director opened the cover, his eyes scanning the primary executive summary with growing visible horror. The dossier contained the complete, unredacted forensic audit Jonathan had painstakingly compiled over the past 8 months. It detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer, every manipulated digital ledger, and every offshore shell company Gavin had established in Atlanta to successfully siphon $12 million from my corporate accounts. It included the high-definition photographs of Gavin meeting with the disgraced medical practitioner and the undeniable digital footprint of the federal wire fraud alert he had personally triggered the previous morning at my estate. The boardroom descended into an absolute suffocating silence as the acquiring executives absorbed the sheer magnitude of the criminal enterprise orchestrated by their supposed savior. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the table, watching the color drain entirely from Gavin's face under the harsh, glaring fluorescent lights. He was forced to stand in absolute silence and watch his entire corporate career, his pristine reputation, and his freedom evaporate in real time. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant Ivy League executive was systematically shredded, exposing the desperate, cornered thief underneath. He had walked into the glass high-rise intending to steal an empire, entirely unaware he was stepping onto a public execution block. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging for a negotiation or a shred of mercy that would never come. I steepled my fingers on the oak table, maintaining my cold, unwavering stare. I informed the board that my chief financial officer would no longer be participating in this merger or any future corporate activities. The lead director of the purchasing conglomerate forcefully closed the heavy leather binder. The sound of the thick cover slapping against the polished oak table cracked through the room like a gunshot, instantly snapping the assembled executives out of their stunned silence. He stared directly at me, his face flushed with severe professional outrage. He stated in absolute, uncompromising terms that an $86 million acquisition could not possibly proceed under the shadow of a massive internal embezzlement scandal. He explained that corporate theft of this staggering magnitude indicated severe operational negligence, completely tainting the company valuation and introducing an unacceptable level of federal liability. He reached for his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, announcing his intention to instruct his legal team to draft an immediate formal withdrawal from the merger. The tension inside the glass-walled high-rise became physically suffocating. Gavin watched this sudden corporate implosion unfold from his isolated position near the corner of the boardroom. The initial paralyzing terror that had gripped him upon my entrance slowly morphed into a twisted, malicious satisfaction. A dark, arrogant smirk crept across his pale face. He realized that while his own financial life was effectively over, he had successfully detonated a catastrophic bomb at the very center of my life's work. He genuinely believed that his personal failure had simultaneously destroyed the crowning achievement of my career. He stood taller, crossing his arms over his chest, taking a perverse, vindictive comfort in the concept of mutual destruction. He believed the acquiring conglomerate would walk away today, leaving my company in absolute financial ruin and tying my legacy up in years of federal audits and toxic corporate litigation. He prepared to watch my empire burn to the ground right alongside him, entirely convinced that his actions had dealt a fatal blow to the Dawson estate. I did not break eye contact with the furious lead director. I did not show a single fraction of the panic Gavin so desperately expected to see. Instead, I let a cold, clinical smile touch the corners of my mouth. I gestured calmly toward the leather-bound dossier resting firmly under the director's right hand. I instructed him to open the binder to the final indexed tab prominently labeled as the source of funds addendum. The director hesitated clearly, frustrated, before flipping to the designated section. He read the banking routing numbers and the internal transfer ledgers displayed on the crisp white pages. I explained the absolute financial reality of the situation with unwavering precision. The $12 million Gavin had meticulously siphoned over the past 2 years did not originate from the company operational accounts. It had never touched our payroll, our vendor reserves, or our corporate profit margins. I informed the silent room that I had explicitly identified Gavin as a severe financial liability 14 months ago. I had noticed his increasingly erratic behavior, his sudden affinity for aggressive luxury, and his highly subtle attempts to circumvent our internal auditing software. Instead of firing him and risking a messy public wrongful termination lawsuit that could easily spook potential buyers, I laid a highly sophisticated invisible trap. I utilized Jonathan's elite forensic accounting team to establish a dummy corporate account. I personally funded this honeypot ledger with $12 million of my own private wealth. I seamlessly integrated this decoy account into the company financial ecosystem, perfectly disguising it as an accessible high-yield reserve fund. I intentionally left the digital backdoor completely open, practically inviting my greedy son-in-law to walk inside. Gavin's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a hollow, sickening comprehension. He realized the brilliant, untraceable embezzlement scheme he thought he had executed was entirely manufactured by his target. I had watched his every move, tracking every single stolen dollar as it transferred from my personal offshore accounts to his failing real estate shells in Atlanta. He had never outsmarted the corporate security. He had simply followed the financial breadcrumbs I had deliberately placed in front of him. I addressed the board of directors with the commanding authority of a man entirely in control of his domain. I assured them that our corporate balance sheets remained perfectly clean and entirely uncompromised. The official financial health of the logistics company was exactly as presented during our initial merger negotiations. I looked directly at the lead director, confirming that the $86 million acquisition was completely valid, structurally sound, and entirely free of any internal liability. Gavin did not steal a single cent from the business entity they were purchasing today. He committed a massive documented theft against my personal private estate. The legal distinction was absolute and impenetrable. The acquiring executives processed the sheer tactical brilliance of the maneuver in awed silence. The aggressive tension immediately evaporated from the boardroom, rapidly replaced by a profound collective respect for my ruthless foresight. The lead director slowly closed the dossier again, a distinct look of professional admiration crossing his face as he nodded his firm approval. He picked up his gold pen, signaling to the room that the merger would proceed without any further delay. Several board members actually clapped a brief applause, acknowledging the flawless execution of the clean hands doctrine. I turned my attention back to my former chief financial officer. The federal wire fraud charges generated by his panicked attempt to access the frozen funds this morning were now utterly unavoidable. He was permanently trapped in an airtight federal case with a pristine paper trail documenting his theft of private wealth across state lines. The realization of his absolute inescapable ruin struck him with physical force. His breathing turned ragged and shallow as the glass walls of the high-rise seemed to close in on him. He looked around the room, finding zero sympathy in the cold, calculating stares of the corporate executives. He had absolutely no leverage left to pull, no corporate hostage to hold over my head, and no money to mount a defense. He spun around and practically sprinted toward the heavy double doors, fleeing the boardroom in a blind, uncoordinated panic. He knew his corporate life was permanently obliterated. He knew the FBI would be actively hunting him within the hour. He intended to make his final chaotic stand in family court, desperately clinging to the fabricated conservatorship petition as his absolute last shield against federal prison. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B remained tightly shut, trapping the stifling recycled air inside the small judicial chamber. Friday morning had finally arrived, bringing with it the absolute climax of Gavin's desperate corporate siege. He sat rigidly at the petitioner's table, his expensive charcoal suit clinging to his profusely sweating frame. The catastrophic cascading failures of the past 24 hours should have broken his resolve entirely. He had been forcefully expelled from the hospital under the threat of a domestic terror injunction, physically barred from ever approaching his paralyzed wife again. The federal authorities were actively dismantling the digital infrastructure of his $12 million embezzlement, systematically locking down his offshore accounts in Atlanta. Despite this overwhelming reality, the sheer magnitude of his impending ruin had triggered a psychotic, tunnel-visioned delusion. He firmly believed he still possessed the ultimate, unbeatable trump card. He clutched the forged medical affidavit tightly in his damp hands, treating the falsified document as his absolute last lifeline. In his fractured, panicked mind, gaining legal conservatorship over my person was the only remaining shield against federal prison. If a family court judge declared me officially incompetent and handed him the keys to the physical estate, Gavin calculated he could legally justify the massive financial transfers as emergency medical expenditures. He planned to leverage the court order to retroactively validate his theft, presenting himself to the federal authorities as a desperate son-in-law liquidating assets to save a dying patriarch. It was a strategy born of pure, unadulterated madness, relying entirely on aggressive momentum and a compliant legal system. I sat silently at the respondents' table, flanked by Jonathan and his lead litigation associate. I did not project the frail, shattered persona Gavin had anticipated. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit, my posture perfectly erect, my hands resting calmly on the polished oak table. I watched Gavin systematically unravel. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, his eyes darting frantically around the silent courtroom. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that his final stand was built on a foundation of gasoline, and Jonathan was currently holding the match. The heavy oak door behind the judicial bench swung open, and the presiding judge entered the chamber. She was a stern, uncompromising woman with a sharp, analytical gaze and an established reputation for possessing zero tolerance for legal theatrics. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and began systematically reciting the core claims outlined in Gavin's emergency ex parte petition. Her voice was flat and clinical as she detailed the horrific fabricated allegations of my rapid cognitive decline, severe memory blackouts, and violent mood swings. Gavin's high-priced defense attorney, a slick litigator funded entirely by stolen money, immediately called their primary expert witness to the stand. The disgraced neurological physician walked down the center aisle wearing a tailored navy suit specifically chosen to project an aura of unassailable medical authority. He took the oath with practiced ease, settling into the witness box and adjusting the microphone. Gavin leaned forward, a sick, desperate glimmer of hope returning to his bloodshot eyes. Under direct examination, the corrupt doctor confidently launched into a terrifyingly precise perjury. He cited specific dates and times for comprehensive neurological examinations that had never actually occurred. He spoke eloquently about administering complex cognitive memory tests in the private study of my estate, falsely claiming that I had failed to recognize basic family members or understand simple financial concepts. He categorized my condition as an aggressive, irreversible form of early-onset Alzheimer's disease, explicitly warning the judge that leaving me in control of my vast estate posed an immediate catastrophic danger to both my family and my own physical safety. He painted a masterful, tragic portrait of a titan of industry whose brilliant mind had completely decayed, leaving behind a confused, volatile shell, requiring immediate, involuntary institutionalization. The physician concluded his direct testimony with a grave, rehearsed sigh, formally recommending that Gavin be granted absolute conservatorship to manage my medical care and financial assets. The execution of the lie was seamless. Gavin sat back in his chair, exhaling a long, shuddering breath, fully convinced the court had swallowed the deception. The judge turned her sharp gaze toward the respondent's table, officially inviting my legal counsel to cross-examine the medical expert. Jonathan stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, deliberate precision that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. He did not carry a single medical chart. He did not bring up a copy of the diagnostic manual, nor did he intend to waste a single second debating the fabricated symptoms of a phantom disease. He walked directly to the center of the courtroom and completely ignored the physician's medical credentials. Jonathan simply raised his right hand and signaled the court clerk sitting beside the judicial bench. The massive high-definition digital monitor mounted on the far wall of the courtroom hummed to life. The screen did not display a brain scan or a disputed neurological evaluation. It projected a crystal-clear, heavily magnified image of an international banking statement. The document was meticulously highlighted in bright yellow, drawing the entire courtroom's immediate attention to a single devastating line item. Jonathan turned to face the witness box, his voice ringing with Arctic lethal clarity. He did not ask the doctor about Alzheimer's. He asked him to explain the direct expedited wire transfer of exactly $25,000 explicitly detailed on the screen. The financial record clearly showed the funds originating directly from Gavin's fraudulent real estate shell company based in Atlanta. The receiving account belonged exclusively to the personal checking account of the doctor currently sitting under oath. Jonathan read the timestamp of the transaction aloud, letting the fatal chronological reality hang in the stifling air. The massive payoff had been initiated at exactly 6 in the morning, mere hours after Gavin had slipped the lethal synthetic neuroinhibitor into Naomi's wine glass at the steakhouse. The brutal, undeniable transaction proved that the medical evaluation was not an objective diagnosis. It was a pre-purchased, federally documented assassination of my legal autonomy. The color drained entirely from the physician's face, his professional arrogance shattering instantly as he stared at the digital proof of his own criminal conspiracy. Gavin gripped the edge of the petitioner's table, his knuckles turning white, physically paralyzed as the inescapable reality of his federal trap snapped shut. The digital projection of the $25,000 wire transfer loomed over the courtroom like an unyielding digital executioner. The disgraced physician stared at the glowing monitor, his perfectly cultivated aura of medical authority evaporating in a single, devastating heartbeat. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray against the crisp white collar of his tailored navy suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp emerged from his throat. He looked wildly at Gavin, then up at the stern, unyielding face of the presiding judge, and finally at Jonathan, who stood with the relaxed, lethal patience of a predator who had already sprung an inescapable trap. The doctor realized instantly that the legal net closing around him was completely airtight. He was staring directly at a federal wire fraud indictment and immediate mandatory prison time for committing perjury in a court of law. Raw self-preservation completely overrode his lucrative illicit arrangement with the desperate executive. He slumped forward, gripping the wooden edges of the witness stand as his knees threatened to give way entirely. He leaned directly into the microphone, his voice a frantic, high-pitched tremble that echoed harshly off the mahogany walls. He confessed entirely and without reservation. He stammered out the exact chronological details of the corrupt transaction, frantically admitting that Gavin had approached him the very morning after the steakhouse poisoning incident. He detailed the initial cash deposits handed over in unmarked envelopes and the subsequent wire transfers utilized to guarantee his absolute silence and loyalty. He explicitly stated under oath that he had never conducted a single memory test or neurological evaluation on Jonathan's client. He confessed that the entire medical affidavit was a complete fabricated work of fiction, dictated word for word by Gavin to legally weaponize the family court system. Every syllable out of the doctor's mouth was a heavy iron nail driven directly into Gavin's coffin. The gallery remained in a state of suffocating, stunned silence, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the medical corruption. Gavin sat paralyzed at the petitioner's table, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The absolute trump card he had staked his entire freedom upon had just turned into the primary instrument of his legal destruction. The fraudulent foundation of his entire corporate and personal takeover was being systematically dismantled under oath, and he lacked any conceivable mechanism to stop the bleeding. Gavin's high-priced defense attorney did not waste a single fraction of a second attempting to salvage the catastrophic situation. He had been retained with what he now firmly realized was stolen capital, and he instantly recognized the immediate radioactive threat of being professionally implicated in an active, documented federal conspiracy. He stood up abruptly, the sharp, aggressive snapping of his leather briefcase breaking the heavy silence of the courtroom as he rapidly swept his legal pads and pens inside. He turned his back entirely on his client, refusing to even acknowledge Gavin's frantic, pleading gaze. The attorney looked directly at the presiding judge, his voice projecting pure, unadulterated professional distance. He formally and urgently requested an emergency motion to immediately withdraw as counsel of record. He explicitly cited an irreconcilable ethical conflict and an absolute refusal to be associated with the subornation of perjury and coordinated financial fraud. The judge, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial contempt for the petitioner's table, granted the motion with a swift, echoing strike of her wooden gavel. The attorney turned and walked swiftly down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy double doors and abandoning Gavin completely to the merciless grinding of the judicial machinery. Total panic finally broke through Gavin's physical paralysis. He was entirely alone, stripped of his medical expert, his legal representation, and his financial leverage. He leaped up from the petitioner's table, nearly knocking over his heavy wooden chair in his frantic desperation. He ignored all standard courtroom decorum, waving his arms and launching into a wild, hysterical tirade directed at the bench. He desperately attempted to construct a final, pathetic narrative, shouting that the entire proceeding was an elaborate, malicious setup. He screamed that his father-in-law was a ruthless tyrant, manipulating the legal system through his exorbitant wealth and private security forces. He pointed a trembling finger at the respondent's table, insisting that the bank wire transfers were entirely fabricated, that the doctor had been violently threatened, and that he was the only person genuinely trying to save his wife and the corporate empire. The judge struck her gavel a second time, a sharp, deafening crack that demanded immediate silence, but Gavin refused to stop. He raved that the court was being blinded by money, frantically trying to shout his way out of an inescapable snare. Jonathan did not react to Gavin's hysterical outburst. He did not object to the wild, baseless accusations, nor did he request that the judge hold the flailing executive in contempt. He simply allowed Gavin to exhaust himself, waiting in absolute disciplined silence, while the frantic screaming echoed against the courtroom walls and slowly died down into heavy, desperate panting. Once Gavin finally ran out of oxygen and stood trembling in the center of the room, Jonathan turned his attention calmly back to the court clerk. He formally requested permission to submit a final definitive digital exhibit to officially close the cross-examination and entirely resolve the matter of his client's cognitive competence. The judge nodded silently, her gaze fixed coldly on the sweating, disheveled man standing entirely exposed at the petitioner's table. The massive projection screen shifted from the damning bank transfer document to a high-definition video file. The footage had been captured by the covert security cameras seamlessly embedded within the mahogany bookshelves of the estate's primary living room. The courtroom speakers hummed to life, projecting perfectly clear, digitally enhanced audio. The entire gallery watched in absolute horrified fascination as the scene played out. Gavin appeared on the massive screen, pacing arrogantly back and forth in front of the leather armchair where I sat in feigned, silent vacancy. The video captured Gavin at the absolute height of his manufactured power, his voice dripping with vicious, unadulterated malice. He openly bragged to my supposedly empty, senile face about discovering the hidden wall safe and stripping the financial ledgers. He gleefully detailed his flawless execution of the forged medical proxies and explicitly outlined his master plan to lock me away in a secure, maximum-capacity psychiatric facility while he liquidated my entire logistics empire. Every arrogant sneer, every confessed crime, and every gleeful admission of his $12 million theft was broadcast in glaring, undeniable clarity. Gavin stood frozen in the center of the courtroom, his eyes wide and completely hollow as he watched his own digital ghost confess to every single felony he had desperately tried to deny. The crushing realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There had never been a moment of privacy. There had never been a single tactical advantage. He had been completely surveilled, recorded, and meticulously cataloged from the very beginning. The video faded to black, leaving the silent, echoing finality of his own voice hanging over the courtroom, as the judge reached for her phone to summon the federal marshals waiting in the hallway. The heavy silence of the courtroom settled over Gavin like a physical weight pinning him to his chair. He remained rooted to the spot, his chest heaving, the digital echo of his own arrogance still ringing in his ears from the video confession. The presiding judge adjusted her heavy black robes, her face a mask of absolute judicial disgust. She slowly removed her reading glasses, folding them with a sharp click, and placed them firmly on the elevated mahogany bench. She leaned directly into the microphone, her voice carrying the sharp, uncompromising edge of impending doom. She stated that the petition for conservatorship was not merely a fabrication, but a vicious, malicious weaponization of the family court system. She announced her immediate intention to dismiss the filing with extreme prejudice and sanction the petitioner for a profound abuse of the judicial process. Gavin squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling violently as he braced for the total collapse of his corporate and legal existence. Before the judge could strike her gavel and finalize the dismissal, Jonathan stepped back into the center aisle. He raised his hand with absolute, unhurried calm. He requested the court's indulgence for a single final submission, noting that the evidence was not merely relevant to the family court proceeding, but pertained specifically to the jurisdiction of the district attorney. Jonathan gestured toward the back of the gallery. A tall, sharply dressed man with an unmistakable posture of legal authority sat in the back row, observing the entire hearing with intense, calculating focus. The district attorney of the county had been quietly invited by Jonathan hours earlier, completely unbeknownst to Gavin. Jonathan turned his attention back to the bench and formally called his final witness to the stand. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open with a heavy creak. Leo stepped into the aisle wearing a pressed, simple suit that contrasted sharply with his usual waiter's uniform. He walked past the gallery, his posture rigid but determined, ignoring the frantic, terrified look Gavin shot in his direction. Leo took the oath, his voice steady and clear, echoing through the silent chamber. He sat in the witness box, a young man thrust into the center of a multi-million-dollar corporate war. Gavin's hands shook against the oak table. He recognized the waiter immediately. The desperate strategy to isolate Dawson at the steakhouse, the carefully coordinated poisoning, the entire genesis of his hostile takeover, was suddenly sitting under oath, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Jonathan approached the witness box with measured, methodical precision. He did not waste time establishing character or background. He drove straight to the center of the conflict. He asked Leo to recount the exact events that transpired in the rear corridor of the luxury steakhouse on the night Naomi was abruptly hospitalized. Leo leaned into the microphone. He spoke clearly, detailing the aggressive physical intimidation he experienced when two men in dark suits cornered him by the service elevators. He described the heavy white envelope they shoved into his chest, the thick stack of $100 bills offered as a bribe, and the explicit threatening instructions to contaminate Naomi's specific glass of wine. Gavin frantically gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles bone white, desperately wanting to scream that the boy was lying, but the absolute lack of legal counsel left him completely gagged and defenseless. Jonathan did not let the testimony stand alone. He turned to the court clerk and requested the final digital exhibit. The massive projection screen flared to life once more. The courtroom watched a crisp, high-definition security feed sourced directly from the steakhouse's internal surveillance grid. The footage clearly displayed the narrow, dimly lit service corridor. The timestamp on the bottom corner perfectly aligned with Leo's testimony. The video showed Gavin stepping out of the shadows, his face clearly illuminated by the overhead emergency lights. He stood with the two hired thugs pulling a small, distinct white envelope from the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He handed the envelope directly to the larger man, pointing aggressively toward the main dining room. The transfer of the synthetic neuroinhibitor was captured in irrefutable, undeniable detail. The visual proof of premeditation slammed into the courtroom with the force of a freight train. It was not a tragic accident. It was not a spontaneous medical event. It was a cold, calculated, and heavily financed attempted murder. The footage proved Gavin's absolute intent to cause grievous bodily harm to his own wife to secure his path to the Dawson estate. The entire gallery sat paralyzed, watching the raw mechanical reality of Gavin's sociopathy laid bare on the digital screen. Leo pointed directly at the monitor, explicitly identifying Gavin as the man directing the entire operation. Gavin's breathing turned into ragged, shallow gasps. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were rapidly closing in, crushing the last remaining pockets of air from his lungs. The projection screen faded to black, but the devastating impact of the footage continued to reverberate through the stifling chamber. The presiding judge stared at the empty screen, her jaw tightly clenched in pure, unadulterated judicial outrage. She had presided over bitter divorces and highly contested estates, but the sheer calculated lethality of this conspiracy was completely unprecedented. She turned her furious gaze toward the petitioner's table, looking at Gavin not as a desperate litigant, but as an active, lethal predator. Before she could articulate the massive financial sanctions she was preparing to levy, movement in the back of the gallery seized the room's absolute attention. The district attorney stood up from the wooden bench, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, decisive motion. He walked down the center aisle, moving with the heavy, undeniable authority of state power. He completely bypassed the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the legal teams and approached the bench directly. He did not ask for a recess. He did not suggest convening a grand jury for a later date to review the newly submitted files. He addressed the judge with a voice that commanded absolute silence. He explicitly cited the overwhelming, undeniable mountain of evidence presented within the last hour. He listed the massive documented financial fraud confirmed by the corporate forensic audit. He highlighted the felony perjury suborned by the disgraced medical physician who had just fled the stand. Finally, he pointed to the high-definition surveillance footage confirming an orchestrated, premeditated poisoning attempt against Naomi Dawson. The district attorney formally requested the presiding judge to issue an immediate on-the-spot, no-bail arrest warrant for Gavin directly on the courtroom floor. He categorized the executive as an extreme flight risk and an active, documented danger to society. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. She slammed her wooden gavel down with terminal force, granting the district attorney's emergency motion instantly. Two armed court bailiffs immediately stepped away from the side walls, unsnapping the heavy leather retention straps on their utility belts. They closed in on Gavin's position with swift tactical precision. Gavin stumbled backward, his chair crashing loudly to the polished floor. He looked wildly at the approaching bailiffs, then at the district attorney, and finally at the stoic, unmoving face of his father-in-law. The massive, impenetrable trap had snapped completely shut, leaving him absolutely nowhere to run. Would the federal authorities reach him before the county jail swallowed him whole? The sharp, deafening crack of the judge's wooden gavel struck the mahogany-sounding block with the terminal force of a guillotine dropping. The sound fractured the stifling, recycled air of the courtroom, instantly sealing the absolute destruction of Gavin's reality. The presiding judge did not hesitate. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure judicial authority as she formally granted the district attorney's emergency motion for an immediate no-bail arrest. At her explicit command, the two heavily built court bailiffs moved away from the perimeter walls with terrifying, synchronized precision. Their heavy leather boots thudded against the polished floorboards, closing the distance to the petitioner's table in seconds. The distinct metallic rasp of steel handcuffs being unhooked from their tactical belts echoed through the paralyzed gallery. Gavin sat completely frozen in his chair, his custom-tailored charcoal suit soaked through with cold sweat. The sheer physical reality of federal incarceration was manifesting right in front of his eyes, shattering the final remnants of his arrogant corporate facade. He shoved his heavy wooden chair backward with a violent, panicked jerk, the legs screeching harshly against the floor. He sprang to his feet, his breath hitching into rapid, shallow gasps as raw, unadulterated terror flooded his veins. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the small judicial chamber, desperately scanning the wood-paneled walls for an exit strategy that did not exist. He looked toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom, but a third armed deputy had already moved to block the primary threshold, standing with his arms crossed and his stance wide. Gavin was entirely boxed in, physically and legally cornered within a windowless room entirely surrounded by sworn officers of the law. There were no corporate loopholes left to exploit, no forged medical proxies to hide behind, and no millions of dollars in stolen capital to buy his way out of the snare. He backed away from the approaching bailiffs, his shoulders hitting the wooden barrier separating the legal teams from the gallery. He was a cornered predator, realizing for the very first time that he was completely trapped inside the cage he had confidently built for someone else. The lead bailiff closed the final gap, seizing Gavin's flailing right arm with an uncompromising vice-like grip and wrenching it sharply behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked securely around Gavin's wrists, with a harsh ratcheting sound that finally broke the last remaining thread of his psychological restraint. As the metal bit into his skin, Gavin completely lost his mind. The sophisticated Ivy League financial officer vanished, replaced by a frantic, rabid animal thrashing against the inescapable grip of state power. He twisted his neck, screaming a torrent of hysterical, spittle-flecked vitriol directly at the presiding judge. He accused the court of blatant corruption, wildly claiming that the entire judicial system had been bought and paid for by the Dawson estate. The bailiffs tightened their hold forcefully, subduing his thrashing shoulders, but they could not silence the manic explosion of his shattered ego. Gavin violently pivoted his gaze away from the bench and locked his furious, bulging eyes directly onto his father-in-law. His face contorted into a mask of absolute ugly rage as he unleashed a desperate tirade of unhinged entitlement. He shrieked that he inherently deserved every single cent of the $12 million he had siphoned from the offshore accounts. He bellowed that his brilliance had kept the logistics empire afloat, claiming that he had carried the entire corporate burden while running the financial books flawlessly for years. He screamed that marrying into the family was a sacrifice that entitled him to exactly half of the conglomerate's total valuation, framing his calculated, premeditated theft as rightful compensation for his corporate stewardship. His voice cracked and echoed terribly off the high ceilings, exposing the dark, narcissistic core of a man who genuinely believed his own sociopathic lies. I did not object to his screaming, nor did I look away. I stood up slowly from the respondent's table, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, unhurried precision. I walked around the heavy oak desk and moved across the center aisle, stepping directly into Gavin's line of sight. I approached my screaming son-in-law with the slow, methodical pacing of a man who had already won the war and was simply arriving to survey the ruins of his enemy. Gavin's frantic shouting choked off in his throat as I stopped merely inches away from his face. The two massive bailiffs held him firmly in place, keeping his restrained body entirely immobile as I invaded his personal space. I did not raise my voice to compete with his fading hysteria. I did not offer a grand theatrical monologue for the benefit of the watching gallery or the district attorney standing nearby. I leaned in extremely close, invading the shrinking perimeter of his ruined world. I looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes, letting the full, crushing weight of his absolute defeat settle heavily upon his shoulders. My tone was as cold and unyielding as winter iron. I whispered the absolute truth directly into his ear, ensuring the words would haunt the silence of his federal prison cell for the rest of his natural life. I told him he never married my daughter, that he had only ever married my bank account, and now he was left with absolutely neither. The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow, instantly stripping away the last remaining shreds of his defensive delusion. The brief, agonizing moment of clarity washed over his pale face as he finally understood the totality of his loss. He possessed no wife, no empire, no stolen millions, and absolutely no future. I stepped back, severing the eye contact entirely, and nodded once to the commanding bailiff. They instantly hauled Gavin backward, dragging him forcefully toward the rear exit. Gavin's legs gave out completely, his expensive leather loafers scraping uselessly against the polished floorboards as he was physically carried out of the chamber. He resumed his desperate, incoherent, screaming, thrashing blindly against the officers as they dragged him through the threshold. His manic shrieks echoed harshly down the exterior marble hallway, fading into a pathetic, distant wail of pure despair. The third deputy stepped forward, grabbing the brass handles of the heavy oak doors and pulling them shut with a massive, echoing slam. The physical barrier severed the last sound of Gavin's existence, leaving a profound, ringing silence in his wake. I stood in the center of the quiet courtroom, adjusting my cuffs, perfectly content in the absolute stillness of a completely secured empire. Monday morning arrived over the Charlotte skyline without a single trace of the chaos that had consumed the previous week. Inside the quiet, mahogany-paneled confines of Jonathan's private law office, the final legal hurdles of the corporate acquisition dissolved seamlessly. The acquiring conglomerate, fully satisfied by the surgical removal of the internal threat and the impeccable cleanliness of the company's authentic ledgers, officially signed the closing documents. The digital transfer initiated exactly at 9 o'clock. $68 million moved securely through international routing channels, bypassing the traditional corporate holding accounts entirely. The massive sum landed directly inside a newly structured ironclad charitable trust that Jonathan had meticulously designed. The trust was legally impenetrable, entirely shielded from any future frivolous litigation, marital claims, or hostile family maneuvers. Dawson sat across from Jonathan, watching the digital confirmation illuminate the laptop screen. He simply nodded, sipping his black coffee. The logistics empire he had built with decades of sweat and sacrifice was successfully liquidated and permanently secured. Miles away from the quiet triumph of the law office, a drastically different reality settled over the county correctional facility. Gavin sat on the rigid metal bunk of his holding cell, staring blankly at the cinder block wall. The expensive tailored suits and the arrogant Ivy League swagger had been entirely stripped away, replaced by standard-issue institutional clothing and the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. He was entirely isolated. The federal authorities had officially assumed jurisdiction over his case, filing a staggering list of charges that included aggravated wire fraud conspiracy and the subornation of perjury. The undeniable mountain of high-definition video evidence and documented financial ledgers left his newly appointed public defender with absolutely zero leverage for a plea negotiation. Gavin was staring down the barrel of a federal trial that possessed only one inevitable conclusion. He would not see the outside of a maximum security penitentiary for decades. The brilliant sociopathic mastermind who had confidently planned to steal an empire and discard his family now possessed absolutely nothing but the echoing silence of a 6x8 concrete box. His grand, meticulous design had not merely failed. It had perfectly constructed the exact cage that would hold him for the rest of his natural life. Naomi's transition into her new reality began in the sterile, quiet wing of a private neurological rehabilitation center on the outskirts of the city. The lingering effects of the synthetic neuroinhibitor required intensive physical therapy, but the total paralysis had officially subsided. She spent her days relearning basic motor functions isolated from the luxurious lifestyle she had previously considered a birthright. She had successfully avoided federal conspiracy and accessory charges by agreeing to a comprehensive immunity deal heavily negotiated by Jonathan. In exchange for her absolute freedom, Naomi provided federal prosecutors with exhaustive, detailed testimony outlining every single aspect of Gavin's financial and medical deception. She handed them the final nails for her husband's coffin, securing her own physical liberty while entirely incinerating her marriage. However, escaping a prison sentence did not mean escaping the consequences of her profound betrayal. On the morning of her official medical discharge, Jonathan visited her room with a final unyielding legal portfolio. He informed her plainly that Dawson had completely and permanently rewritten his estate planning. She was entirely excised from the last will and testament, formally and legally severed from the generational wealth she had conspired to steal. There would be no multi-million-dollar trust funds, no South Park mansion, and no endless stream of corporate dividends. Instead, Jonathan handed her a single brass key and a printed address. Dawson had purchased a modest two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the industrial side of the city. The deed was in her name, free and clear, ensuring she would never face homelessness, but it offered absolutely zero luxury. Alongside the key was a formal offer letter for a low-level entry-level administrative position at a regional shipping warehouse. The salary was strictly minimum wage, requiring her to physically clock in at 6 in the morning 5 days a week. It was not an act of vicious cruelty or vindictive punishment. It was a precise, calculated education. Dawson had provided her with the exact same foundation he had started with 40 years ago. She was given a roof over her head and the opportunity to earn her own survival. If she wanted a better life, she would have to build it with her own two hands, learning the actual grueling value of hard work that she had spent her entire privileged adulthood completely ignoring. Dawson sat comfortably in the heavy wooden rocking chair on the wide wraparound porch of his South Park estate. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the quiet, solitary chill of the approaching autumn. He held a simple ceramic mug of black coffee in his hands, feeling the heat seep into his palms as he watched the vibrant orange and purple hues of the sunrise slowly illuminate the immaculate dew-covered lawn. The sprawling property was entirely silent. There were no frantic phone calls demanding emergency funds, no arrogant executives plotting hostile takeovers in the dining room, and no insidious whispers echoing through the hallways. The suffocating tension that had gripped his life for the past 2 years had been surgically removed. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute tranquility of the morning wash over him. He felt no lingering malice or fiery, triumphant vengeance. He had not sought to utterly destroy his family out of petty spite. He had simply recognized a lethal infection and executed a necessary silent adjustment to preserve his life's work. The millions he had spent setting the honeypot trap, securing Jonathan's elite legal and tactical resources, and orchestrating the flawless courtroom dismantling were worth every single penny. He had effectively protected his legacy from those who saw his lifelong dedication as nothing more than a convenient resource to be exploited and discarded. The vast wealth he had accumulated would now serve a higher protected purpose through the charitable trust entirely out of the reach of calculated greed. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter, robust flavor grounding him perfectly in the present moment. The pain of recognizing his daughter's true nature and his son-in-law's sociopathic ambition had been severe, but it had ultimately forged an unbreakable armor around his final years. He did not feel lonely in the vast empty estate. He felt profoundly liberated. He had reclaimed his absolute autonomy, proving that an aging patriarch was not a fading target to be easily managed and quietly erased. His dignity remained flawlessly intact, his empire was secure, and the profound, peaceful silence of the morning finally belonged entirely to him. He leaned back in the rocking chair, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. The game was definitively over, the board completely cleared of toxic elements. Dawson closed his eyes, savoring the absolute certainty that the rest of his natural life would be lived entirely on his own uncompromising terms. Dawson sat comfortably in the heavy wooden rocking chair on the wide wraparound porch of his South Park estate. The early morning air carried the solitary chill of the approaching autumn. He held a simple ceramic mug of black coffee in his weathered hands, feeling the radiating heat as he watched the vibrant orange hues of the sunrise slowly illuminate the immaculate dew-covered lawn. The sprawling property was entirely silent. There were no frantic phone calls demanding emergency funds, no arrogant executives plotting hostile takeovers in the dining room, and no insidious whispers echoing through the hallways. The suffocating tension that had gripped his life for the past 2 years had been surgically removed. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute tranquility of the morning wash over him. He felt no lingering malice or fiery, triumphant vengeance. He had not sought to utterly destroy his family out of petty spite or blind anger. He had simply recognized a lethal infection and executed a necessary silent adjustment to preserve his life's work and his physical safety. The millions he had spent setting the honeypot trap, securing Jonathan's elite legal resources, and orchestrating the flawless courtroom dismantling were worth every single penny. He had effectively protected his legacy from those who saw his lifelong dedication as nothing more than a convenient resource to be exploited and violently discarded. The vast wealth he had accumulated would now serve a higher protected purpose through the charitable trust, entirely out of the reach of calculated greed. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter, robust flavor grounding him perfectly in the present moment. The pain of recognizing his daughter's true nature and his son-in-law's sociopathic ambition had been severe, but it had ultimately forged an unbreakable armor around his final years. He did not feel lonely in the vast, empty estate. He felt profoundly liberated. He had reclaimed his absolute autonomy, proving that an aging patriarch was not a fading target to be easily managed and quietly erased. His dignity remained flawlessly intact. His empire was secure, and the profound, peaceful silence of the morning finally belonged entirely to him. He leaned back in the rocking chair, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. The game was definitively over, the board completely cleared of toxic elements. Dawson closed his eyes, savoring the absolute certainty that the rest of his natural life would be lived entirely on his own uncompromising terms. The profound journey of this family conflict reveals a harsh but undeniably necessary truth about the nature of conditional love and the absolute necessity of personal boundaries. We often endure unacceptable behavior from those closest to us, simply because they share our bloodline or live under our roof. We mistake silent endurance for noble sacrifice, allowing toxic individuals to systematically drain our emotional and financial resources while demanding endless gratitude in return. True family is never built on a foundation of entitlement, manipulation, or predatory calculation. Real love requires mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and a shared commitment to protecting one another from harm. When a relationship devolves into a calculated extraction of wealth, it ceases to be a family dynamic and transforms into a hostile transaction. His story teaches us that protecting your dignity is never an act of cruelty. Walking away from people who actively plot your destruction is the ultimate expression of honor. Age does not diminish your right to absolute autonomy, and you are never obligated to finance the comfortable lives of adults who view you as nothing more than a disposable asset. Setting firm, unyielding boundaries is often the only mechanism available to force ungrateful individuals to completely face the reality of their own total incompetence. By removing the financial safety net, we stop enabling their worst impulses and force them to build their own character through authentic, grueling daily effort. You cannot buy genuine affection, and you simply cannot negotiate with a ruthless predator. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer a deeply flawed child is the harsh, unfiltered consequence of their own terrible daily choices. True peace is only ever found when you finally stop fighting to be loved by those who only wish to use you and respect yourself instead. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. Share your thoughts on setting boundaries and protecting your peace. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.